There is a moment in every player's life when the crowd stops cheering and the sound of the band fades into silence. The lights dim, the adrenaline cools, and what remains is not victory or defeat, but identity. For many, that identity was formed long before they reached the professional field. It was shaped on a college campus, wrapped in school colors, bound by traditions, and hardened by rivalry. Those rivalries never die. They are stitched into the fabric of the players who carry them forward. I have stood on professional sidelines and seen men who once shared the same locker room glare across the line of scrimmage with the same fire they carried on a college Saturday. I have seen hands that once saluted a university flag clench into fists when confronted by a familiar rival. The field may change, the paycheck may grow, but the roots of competition run too deep to be forgotten. The truth is simple and haunting. The NFL was built not only on talent and strategy, but on unresolved emotion imported from the college game. College football in America is more than sport. It is geography and heritage. It is religion disguised as recreation. It is fathers and sons, alumni and strangers, entire states divided by a single kickoff. Rivalries like Michigan and Ohio State, Alabama and Auburn, Texas and Oklahoma carved their way into American identity. For the students who played, those rivalries shaped every practice, every bruise, and every dream of something greater. When the professional league came calling, it did not just draft players, it drafted the grudges, the loyalty, and the hatred that came with them. In the early years of professional football, when the league was struggling to find respectability, college legends were its lifeline. The public trusted college heroes more than it trusted the fledgling professional sport. Teams wanted the all-American names that newspapers had already anointed as icons. But when those players arrived, they brought more than skill. They brought scars from campus wars that had never healed. The league became a melting pot of old enemies forced to share a new jersey. The stories were whispered before they were written. A running back from Michigan refusing to block for his quarterback because he had been an Ohio State star. A defensive lineman targeting a former rival during practice drills with the quiet promise of payback. Coaches would laugh it off, calling it healthy competition, but the undertone was always darker. The college feuds that had filled stadiums were now shaping professional locker rooms. I remember reading the account of a 1950s team meeting where two veterans refused to sit in the same row. One had worn the blue and gold of Notre Dame, the other the cardinal of USC. The coach ended the session early because the tension was unbearable. Decades later, another story emerged from the same franchise about a young assistant coach who was warned never to recruit players from a rival school because the general manager believed they were soft. These were not isolated attitudes. They were the unspoken rule of an era when the lines between Saturday loyalty and Sunday professionalism blurred beyond repair. As the league grew, so did the mythology of the college game. Television broadcasts in the 1960s and 70s gave those rivalries national reach. Fans who had once belonged to small campus cultures became lifelong ambassadors of their schools. When those same fans watched professional games, their loyalties remained split. They would cheer for their NFL team, but they would cheer louder for the player who shared their alma mater. Stadiums filled with divided hearts. For players, the weight of expectation was suffocating. To play for a college power meant carrying the history of generations. To join the NFL meant confronting those histories again under brighter lights. Some players embraced it, turning rivalry into motivation. Others found it impossible to escape. A receiver once confessed in an interview that he felt more pressure during a college rivalry game than in the Super Bowl. "You can disappoint a city," he said, "but you can't betray your school." That sentiment became the quiet truth behind countless careers. Even the coaches were shaped by those invisible loyalties. Many had cut their teeth in college programs before ascending to the pros. They brought with them the same recruiting philosophies, the same hierarchies of respect and disdain. A coach from the Big Ten might favor players from his region. A Southern coach might distrust Northern toughness. The league pretended to be unified, But behind the scenes, it was a patchwork of cultural allegiances. There is something uniquely American about this inheritance. The college football rivalry is not born from class or politics, but from community. It gives people a tribe. That sense of belonging carries both pride and poison. Pride because it creates passion, and poison because it blinds judgment. When the professional game absorbed that energy, it inherited both its beauty and its darkness. The NFL became a stage where old rivalries sought new audiences. In the 1970s, as television money flooded the league, marketing executives began to realize that these rivalries could be exploited. They would highlight college matchups during broadcasts, introducing former opponents as old enemies. The narrative sold tickets. It also inflamed tension. Players who might have moved past their college battles were reminded over and over that their history was part of the entertainment. The result was predictable. Games that boiled over, late hits justified by pride, and locker rooms divided along lines that were never erased. By the 1980s, those divisions had evolved into something deeper. College football had become a farm system for the NFL, but it was not a neutral one. Alumni networks influenced scouting. University boosters cultivated relationships with team owners. Coaches used old rivalries as motivation in pre-game speeches. The boundary between personal and professional loyalty dissolved. The professional field was no longer a clean slate. It was an extension of the same story that began decades earlier on campus lawns. I have spoken to players who say that the first question they were asked by veterans in the locker room was not about their position or their stats, but where they went to school. The answer determined everything: friendships, rivalries, respect, even safety during scrimmages. In a sport built on teamwork, trust became conditional. That condition was loyalty to one's roots. What fascinates me most is how that culture persisted even as generations changed. Young men born long after the first great rivalries still carried them forward as if by inheritance. They grew up watching their fathers cheer for one team and curse another. By the time they reached the NFL, those emotions had become instinct. A player might share a uniform with a man he once hated as a symbol of a rival state. On Sundays, they were teammates, but deep inside, they remained adversaries. The NFL never publicly acknowledged this undercurrent because the league's image depended on unity and professionalism. Yet, every insider knew it existed. The scouts who refused to evaluate certain schools, the coaches who demanded loyalty to their region, the journalists who favored one program over another. All contributed to an ecosystem where rivalry was not a subplot, but a foundation. There were moments when the consequences of that culture became painfully visible. A late hit during a meaningless preseason game between two former rivals. A fight in training camp triggered by a college insult whispered under the breath. A team divided at its core during a playoff run because the quarterback and the defense represented opposite sides of a collegiate war. The public saw aggression. Insiders saw unfinished history. To understand professional football, one must understand this inheritance. The NFL did not create its own bloodlines. It borrowed them. It took the intensity of college passion and built an empire on it. That passion gave the game its soul, but it also ensured that chaos would always linger beneath the surface. Every tackle, every grudge, every victory still echoes the rivalries that were never resolved. The story of professional football is not just the story of innovation, expansion, and fame. It is the story of rivalry reborn. College loyalty never retired. It simply changed uniforms. And for nearly a century, it has fueled the chaos, the drama, and the humanity that define the NFL's darker side. Before the National Football League became a billion-dollar empire, before it filled Sunday afternoons with spectacle and strategy, the true heartbeat of American football lived on college campuses. Crowds, the marching bands, the regional feuds that divided towns for generations, all of it created a culture so passionate and territorial that it turned football from a pastime into a belief system. In the early 20th century, the idea of professional football was still an afterthought, something seen as crude and mercenary compared to the supposed purity of the college game. The great rivalries, Harvard and Yale, Army and Navy, Michigan and Ohio State, Alabama and Auburn, were already mythic by the time the NFL was born. Those games were not just athletic contests. They were social wars fought on grass, each carrying the weight of regional pride, academic superiority, and class identity. When the NFL emerged in 1920, it was desperate for legitimacy. College football was already decades deep into tradition and prestige, producing legends that newspapers covered, like royalty. The NFL, by contrast, was seen as a league for men who could not let go of the game or who needed the money. To the American public, professionalism in sport was still vaguely shameful, a sign that one was willing to sell something that was meant to be pure. The league's founders knew that to gain public respect, they needed the college system's credibility. That meant recruiting its stars, its traditions, and its rivalries. What they did not anticipate was how much of the college game's psychology would follow those players into the pros. The early decades of the NFL were populated by men who had come from warring schools. Players who had once stood across from each other on opposing sidelines now found themselves wearing the same jersey or facing off again, this time for money instead of pride. But the old animosities never really left them. In locker rooms across the country, informal factions began to form. Ohio State guys here, Michigan guys there, Army men on one side, Notre Dame men on the other. Coaches knew it, owners sensed it. Journalists wrote about it in hushed tones, noting that some teams seemed split by invisible loyalties. The collegiate bloodlines that once fueled amateur glory had followed these men into the professional ranks, carrying with them the language, rituals, and grudges of their youth. Football, at its core, has always been a game of territory, and college rivalries made that concept personal. Every player had once fought for a school that represented not only a place, but an entire way of life. In the Midwest, football symbolized industry and grit. In the South, it became an expression of cultural defiance. On the coasts, it reflected status and intellect. When these cultures collided in the new professional league, the results were volatile. The NFL had wanted the college spirit, but what it inherited instead was division disguised as passion. By the 1930s, as the league began to stabilize and attract more attention, the influence of college football became both its strength and its curse. The most talented players were coming out of powerhouse programs like Notre Dame, Michigan, and Army. Their rivalries were already ingrained into the national consciousness. When these men met again in professional uniforms, it often reignited something primal. The grudges that once electrified college stadiums now added an unpredictable emotional charge to professional games. Coaches loved the intensity it brought, but feared the chaos it could create inside a locker room. The NFL was still trying to define itself. It borrowed heavily from the college aesthetic, the uniforms, the marching bands, the terminology, even the style of play. But while college football could afford to be romantic, the professional game was ruthless. Money, contracts, and reputations were at stake. A college player might have hated a rival in the heat of competition, but a professional athlete could lose his livelihood to one. The difference between rivalry and resentment became a fragile line. Scouting and team building were not immune to this inherited bias. Many coaches came directly from college programs and carried their loyalties with them. A coach from Michigan might favor Michigan players. A coach from the Ivy League might distrust those from state schools. Even executives chose sides, leaning on the networks they had formed years earlier on college fields. What began as camaraderie often turned into favoritism. Some players found themselves shut out of opportunities because of the colors they once wore. Others were drafted not just for their talent, but for the reputation of their alma mater. In this way, college rivalries quietly shaped the power structure of the early NFL. The media amplified it. Newspapers had long covered college rivalries as the pinnacle of sports drama. When the NFL began to rise, those same writers carried their biases forward. They referred to former Michigan players as Wolverines and ex-Notre Dame players as Irishmen, even when they were wearing professional jerseys. The public ate it up. College identity made players easier to market. Fans who once rooted for their university teams could now follow their favorite alumni into the pros. It was a clever strategy that built early NFL fandom, but it also entrenched the divisions that would haunt the league for decades. By the 1940s, professional teams had become mosaics of old college enmities. The Chicago Bears, for instance, often had rosters full of players from Midwestern schools that had fought each other for decades. In the East, franchises like the Giants and Eagles became landing spots for the graduates of Eastern powerhouses such as Army, Navy, and Penn. When those men clashed on Sundays, the atmosphere felt eerily familiar. Reporters noted that games between certain teams carried the tension of a college rivalry reborn. The fans noticed too. They knew the history, the grudges, the stories of betrayal. The league was professional in name, but emotionally it was still deeply collegiate. Over time, this culture extended beyond players and coaches. Owners began to adopt college-like loyalty systems, aligning their organizations with certain regions and recruiting pipelines. Some franchises built long-standing relationships with particular schools, ensuring a steady flow of talent that also carried shared backgrounds and biases. The practice was efficient, but dangerous. Quote, it created echo chambers of identity within teams, often stifling diversity of thought and culture. The NFL's growth into a national institution was built upon this delicate foundation of inherited passion and prejudice. Even the way fans engaged with the sport reflected this lineage. Supporters of professional teams often carried their college affiliations into the stands. A fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers might also be a lifelong supporter of Pitt or Penn State, shaping the language of loyalty that blurred the line between college and professional devotion. In America, football loyalty was rarely isolated. It was generational, territorial, and fiercely personal. The result was that the NFL never fully escaped the emotional architecture of college football. The rivalries that had once been seasonal explosions of pride became permanent psychological undercurrents within the professional game. Every grudge, every perceived slight, every moment of triumph carried echoes of an earlier battle fought under a different banner. Players grew older, contracts changed, franchises relocated, but the old rivalries refused to die. This documentary explores how those unseen forces, those lingering college loyalties, shaped the very identity of professional football. From locker room conflicts to front office decisions. From scouting biases to media narratives, the college game-esque culture of rivalry became both the fuel and the fault line of the NFL's evolution. We will trace how these rivalries not only influenced who succeeded and who failed, but also how they molded the emotional DNA of the league itself. In the episodes to come, we will travel through 20 chapters of this hidden history. We will see how the early stars brought their school colors with them into the pros. How coaches carried their grudges into every sideline decision. How ownership learned to exploit regional pride. And how the modern NFL still echoes with the rivalries of a century ago. This is the untold story of how college football's divisions became the NFL's inheritance. How pride turned into profit. And how every professional feud still whispers the same old campus chants beneath the roar of modern stadiums. The league may have been born in Canton, but its soul was forged on college fields long before. In the late 19th century, when football was still an experiment stitched together from rugby and soccer, college campuses became its first battlegrounds. What began as a curiosity quickly evolved into something elemental, a way for young men to test strength, intellect, and loyalty in front of their peers. Among those early institutions, none shaped the identity of the sport more than Harvard and Yale. Their annual meeting was more than a game. It was a social ritual that defined who held power in the world of American education, and by extension, who ruled the emerging culture of sport itself. The first Harvard-Yale contest in 1875 was chaotic, violent, and rudimentary. Players wore almost no protection. The rules were unclear, and the referees were often former players who sided with their alma mater. Yet that day set in motion a cultural force that extended far beyond the Ivy League. The game became a measure of pride, a symbolic confrontation between two versions of American identity, one refined and intellectual, the other disciplined and defiant. The rivalry's intensity infected every level of the school's communities, from professors to alumni to the newspapers that chronicled every hit. The young sport absorbed that emotion, transforming competition into ritualized combat. As the decades passed, this pattern replicated across the country. Football at Michigan, Ohio State, Army, and Navy was not just about sport, but about belonging. By the early 20th century, these programs had taken the foundational idea of the Harvard-Yale rivalry and expanded it into a national phenomenon. They gave the sport its heartbeat and its bitterness. The Michigan-Ohio State rivalry, born in 1897, elevated conflict into art. Every autumn, their game represented the industrial Midwest, divided by pride, history, and geography. Students from both sides spoke of the other with disdain. Alumni carried grudges through entire lifetimes, and local newspapers treated the matchup as a moral reckoning. It was not merely who won, but who embodied the virtues that Americans valued: toughness, discipline, and resolve. These rivalries shaped not only how the game was played, but how it was felt. Players who stepped onto the field understood that they were representing something far larger than themselves. They were extensions of an institution, avatars of its culture and values. Every tackle carried symbolic weight. Every victory was evidence that one way of life had triumphed over another. In this way, football became a tribal expression of identity. The sport inherited the language and psychology of ancient rivalries, and each campus became a village guarding its honor. By the turn of the century, the college game had become a cultural spectacle. Crowds grew to tens of thousands. Railroad companies arranged special trains to carry fans across state lines. Politicians, businessmen, and writers attended the great rivalries as though they were national events. The Harvard-Yale game became a destination for the American elite, while the Army-Navy contest embodied national service and sacrifice. The Michigan-Ohio State feud drew factory workers and farmers into a shared sense of belonging. Football was no longer a pastime, it was an instrument of identity, a unifying force that simultaneously divided the nation into regions of loyalty. The early players who shaped these rivalries carried the weight of that intensity into their professional lives. When the fledgling NFL began in 1920, it was filled with men who had been shaped by these college conflicts. They had learned football as a language of loyalty and pride. The notion of brotherhood within a team was always shadowed by the memory of an opposing color or chant. For them, the line between competition and hatred was thin and sometimes non-existent. In those early years, when professional teams were still struggling for legitimacy, the players brought with them the emotional architecture of their college past. They played with the same fervor they had once reserved for their alma mater, but now money and reputation amplified the stakes. The Harvard-Yale influence was especially significant. Those schools produced not only players, but thinkers who helped codify the rules and ethics of the game. Walter Camp, a Yale man often called the father of American football, set the template for strategy and structure. Yet even his influence was colored by the same rivalry that defined his youth. Camp's Yale identity permeated the early philosophies of the sport, embedding a sense of elitism and exclusivity into football's foundation. For decades afterward, the Ivy League schools acted as guardians of the sport's purity, even as the professional leagues sought to democratize it. The conflict between purity and professionalism became a reflection of the same tribal tension that had always existed between rival schools. In the Midwest, Michigan and Ohio State transformed football into an instrument of regional expression. The rivalry reflected the industrial transformation of America itself. Michigan represented progress, education, and the ideals of innovation through figures like Fielding Yost, whose teams were known for relentless precision. Ohio State embodied endurance, loyalty, and working-class determination. When their alumni entered the professional game, they carried those traits as badges of identity. Coaches and owners soon noticed. They began to scout not just for skill, but for the intangible qualities associated with certain programs. A Michigan player was seen as strategic and disciplined. An Ohio State player was considered gritty and dependable. What started as emotional branding in college evolved into practical metrics for professional recruitment. This culture of tribal identity gave football its soul, but also its volatility. The college rivalries were a training ground for emotional investment that sometimes bordered on obsession. Fans learned to attach self-worth to victory. Players learned to measure respect through pain and endurance. When these values entered the professional sphere, they gave the NFL its intensity, but also its chaos. The aggression that thrilled college crowds could fracture professional locker rooms. Coaches had to manage not only tactics, but inherited enmities that sometimes resurfaced without warning. By the 1930s, writers were already noticing how the NFL's emotional style mirrored that of college rivalries. The tone of professional games was often described in the same language used to depict the great campus showdowns. The tension, the pageantry, the grudges all carried over. Reporters would casually reference old college matchups when describing new professional ones, as if the NFL were merely a continuation of the same ancient conflicts. This was not an illusion. It was a lineage. Football had become a generational inheritance of pride and defiance. What made these rivalries so enduring was their ability to evolve with the nation. As America changed through wars, economic upheaval, and social transformation, the rivalries adapted. Harvard and Yale remained symbols of prestige, even as their athletic dominance faded. Michigan and Ohio State became industrial titans, producing future coaches, executives, and media figures who would later shape the NFL. Army and Navy, through their annual contests, reinforced the sport's connection to discipline, sacrifice, and national identity. Each rivalry added a new layer to the mythology of football, ensuring that the sport could never be truly neutral. Every player entered the game with a backstory. Every fan brought a bias. The tribal spirit extended beyond the field. Alumni networks reinforced the sense of belonging. Journalists who attended certain schools carried their loyalties into their coverage. Even early broadcasters and executives made decisions through the lens of college identity. The entire ecosystem of football, from rulemaking to recruitment, was colored by these invisible borders. By the time the NFL began to find its national voice, it had already inherited a map of emotional geography drawn decades earlier by college rivalries. Football's evolution into America's defining sport depended on these divisions. They created the drama, the stakes, and the sense of history that made every game feel significant. Rivalries gave the sport a language of memory, something that tied generations together. When fans watched the professional game, they were not just seeing athletes. They were witnessing the continuation of a century-old story told through new uniforms. This is the paradox at the heart of football's rise. The rivalries that gave it life also gave it conflict. They provided passion but also bias, unity but also fracture. They made the sport irresistible because it mirrored human nature itself. Loyal, competitive, proud, and unforgiving. From the first Harvard-Yale clash to the modern professional league, football has always been about identity. The early college rivalries were not just games. They were blueprints for the emotional structure of an entire sport, setting into motion a pattern of tribal loyalty that would define every level of football to come. When the Second World War ended, America began to rebuild itself with new energy and optimism. But beneath the unity of victory lay deep regional identities that never truly disappeared. Football, more than any other sport, became the expression of that divide. The same loyalties that had once defined college campuses now spread across the professional landscape, transforming the NFL from a small regional enterprise into a national mirror of America's cultural geography. North against South, East against Midwest. City against town, every boundary line of the nation found its reflection on the field. In the years following 1945, returning soldiers brought home their college pride. Many had played for storied programs before the war interrupted their athletic careers. They returned with physical scars and a renewed hunger for competition, carrying the flags of their alma maters like heirlooms. When the professional teams began rebuilding their rosters, they looked to these veterans not only for skill, but for the reputation that came with their college backgrounds. To sign a player from Notre Dame, Alabama, or Michigan was to acquire more than an athlete. It was to claim a portion of regional loyalty, a built-in fan base, and the aura of a victorious tradition. The early NFL depended on that inheritance. The league lacked the cultural prestige of college football, which had been the true American stage for half a century. Stadiums like the Rose Bowl, the Big House, and the Cotton Bowl were temples of identity, while professional venues were still modest and uncertain. The NFL's early strategy was to borrow credibility from the colleges that had produced its stars. Newspapers promoted games by highlighting where each player had come from, and fans followed their favorite college heroes into the professional ranks. What emerged was not a unified league, but a loose federation of regional identities, each rooted in the geography of the college game. The northern programs, led by Michigan, Notre Dame, and Ohio State, defined the early style of professional football. Their alumni brought an emphasis on discipline, power running, and structured playbooks. These schools reflected the industrial heartland that surrounded them, a world built on manufacturing, teamwork, and resilience. Midwestern football was a machine, efficient and relentless. Coaches who came from those programs carried that philosophy into the NFL, favoring strong offensive lines and methodical drives that mirrored the assembly lines of Detroit and Chicago. In contrast, the Southern schools represented a different spirit. Programs like Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee emphasized speed, improvisation, and pride born of defiance. The South's history of cultural resistance gave its football a sense of personal honor. Players were taught that victory was not just a goal, but a matter of dignity. When Southern athletes entered the NFL, they carried that intensity with them. They were often underestimated by Northern coaches who viewed Southern football as raw and undisciplined. Yet those players brought flair and ferocity that reshaped the professional game. Their arrival marked the beginning of a subtle cultural clash within the league. The Eastern programs, anchored by the Ivy League, clung to an older vision of the sport. Harvard, Yale, and Princeton continued to view football as an extension of academia, a proving ground for intellect and character rather than a commercial enterprise. While their athletic dominance faded, their influence remained through the men who entered the front offices of professional teams. Many early NFL executives and owners came from Ivy League backgrounds, and their approach reflected a belief in hierarchy, organization, and decorum. To them, football was not only entertainment, but an emblem of American order. This mindset often conflicted with the rugged pragmatism of Midwestern and Southern cultures, creating tension behind the scenes as much as on the field. By the late 1940s, the Midwest had emerged as the heartbeat of professional football, yet the East still controlled its image. Newspapers headquartered in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston shaped public opinion about which teams mattered and which players deserved recognition. The media bias mirrored old college loyalties. Eastern journalists elevated players from nearby schools, while the great Midwestern and Southern athletes were sometimes portrayed as provincial or unsophisticated. The national press, dominated by urban sensibilities, favored the East Coast narrative, leaving much of the country to see professional football as an outsider's game. But America was changing. The population was moving west and south. Industries were shifting, and television was beginning to unify the nation in ways newspapers never could. The rise of television coverage in the 1950s gave the NFL its first opportunity to transcend regional barriers. Yet even in that moment of transformation, the old college divisions shaped how teams were built. The scouting networks of professional franchises were still deeply tied to college coaches. Personal relationships, often formed decades earlier, dictated which schools fed talent to which teams. A head coach who had played at Michigan might rely on former teammates now coaching across the Big Ten. A Southern owner might favor recruits from the SEC. These loyalties influenced not only draft picks, but entire playing styles. Regional pride turned professional football into a cultural battleground. Northern teams prided themselves on structure and endurance. Southern teams prized creativity and spirit. Western teams, emerging later, adopted a style of calculated aggression, influenced by both. Each style had its origins in the college game, and each carried the emotional undertone of competition between regions of the same country. When players from these backgrounds met in professional locker rooms, they often clashed in subtle ways over training methods, communication styles, and even the meaning of victory. What might have seemed like personal conflict was often the echo of regional traditions. The divide was not only about geography, but about class and identity. The Northeast produced executives and strategists who saw football as a business of systems. The Midwest produced working-class players who viewed the game as labor. The South, still wrestling with its cultural scars, turned football into a theater of pride and redemption. Each brought something essential to the NFL's evolution. But their differences also made unity elusive. The league's early decades were filled with quiet rivalries among front offices and coaching staffs that mirrored the divisions on the field. The draft system, introduced to level the playing field, ironically reinforced these divides. Teams tended to draft from the same familiar regions, perpetuating old patterns of bias. Scouts were not yet traveling nationwide, and college loyalty often guided their recommendations. This meant that players from certain regions clustered on certain teams, giving each franchise a cultural identity that mirrored its geography. The Green Bay Packers reflected Midwestern resilience. The Chicago Bears embodied industrial strength. The Washington Redskins, now Commanders, and New York Giants carried the polished demeanor of Eastern tradition. The Los Angeles Rams, emerging later, symbolized Western ambition. These identities were not accidental. They were the direct descendants of college rivalries transplanted into professional soil. The 1950s also saw the rise of integration in football, and here too, the regional divide became evident. Northern and Western teams were more willing to recruit black players from historically black colleges, while many Southern programs resisted. This divide reflected not only social realities, but the cultural conservatism that defined Southern football. As integration progressed, the professional game began to challenge the old order. Yet even then, players often faced bias rooted in where they had played. The NFL's culture of evaluation was still shaped by geography and tradition, and those traditions often mirrored the nation's broader divisions. By the early 1960s, when the league began its march toward national dominance, those regional identities had fused into something complex but potent. The NFL was no longer just a league of teams. It was a mosaic of regional spirits, each with its own heritage and temperament. The Midwestern work ethic, the Southern defiance, the Eastern structure, and the Western ambition all coexisted within a fragile balance. The league's success depended on that balance, yet its rivalries often threatened to tear it apart. The Great Divide of post-war football was not merely about competition. It was about belonging. Fans in Pittsburgh, Dallas, or Los Angeles did not just cheer for teams. They defended ways of life. When players from opposing regions collided on the field, the impact was more than physical. It was cultural, psychological, and deeply American. The early NFL became a map of the nation's soul, revealing through its rivalries the same tensions that shaped its history. The league's journey toward unity would take decades, but its roots were forever marked by the geography of its birth. Every tackle, every play call, and every cheer carried the echo of old college fights and the stubborn pride of regional heritage. Football had become America's most powerful language, and its dialects were written by the regions that built it. In the early decades of professional football, the NFL draft was not the cold, calculated science it is today. It was a game of bias, memory, and emotion. Scouts were often former college players themselves, men who carried the rivalries of their youth like old scars. General managers trusted those memories more than data, and personal grudges were often disguised as football instinct. It was a time when college loyalty blurred into professional decision-making, and the result was a series of drafts colored by old feuds and regional favoritism that would shape the league's competitive balance for years. The college programs that dominated headlines in the 1950s and 1960s: Notre Dame, Alabama, Michigan, Oklahoma, and Texas produced not only players but mythologies. A player's jersey carried the pride of an entire region, and scouts rarely looked at them without prejudice. If a general manager had built his reputation drafting from Big Ten programs, he might have dismissed Southern players as too raw. Conversely, a scout with deep ties to the Southeastern Conference might have written off players from Northern schools as soft. Behind closed doors, these judgments were rooted not in film analysis but in identity, shaped by where they had played, who they had beaten, and which colors they once wore. The most striking example of this came during the 1950s, when Notre Dame alumni working in the league pushed aggressively for Irish players. The program's national prestige and Catholic identity carried weight far beyond the field. Front offices like the Green Bay Packers and the Chicago Cardinals had scouts who trusted Notre Dame graduates almost blindly, believing their discipline and leadership to be superior. But that same bias worked in reverse. Some teams viewed Notre Dame players as overhyped or media-driven, symbols of a college establishment they resented. The rivalry between traditional powers had seeped into the bloodstream of professional football, turning the draft into an extension of the Saturday rivalries. In 1957, one team's decision captured this spirit perfectly. The Detroit Lions front office, heavily staffed with Michigan alumni, bypassed several players from Ohio State despite their dominant college careers. The scouting reports were curiously critical, citing concerns about temperament and team adaptability. The truth was simpler. Those reports were written by men who had spent years despising Ohio State's success. Detroit's bias cost them dearly. A few of those Buckeye players went on to star elsewhere, while the Lions selections failed to make lasting impact. The 1960s amplified the problem as professional football expanded. With new teams came new scouts, many of them hired based on their regional expertise. In theory, this provided balance. In practice, it deepened division. A scout from Texas might have sworn by Southwest Conference players, while one from Pennsylvania would insist that the true toughness of football was born in the steel towns of the East. When the Dallas Cowboys entered the league in 1960, their early drafts leaned heavily toward players from Southern schools. Meanwhile, the Chicago Bears remained stubbornly loyal to the Big Ten pipeline. Each team's roster reflected the geography and pride of its front office rather than the objective best talent available. College bias wasn't limited to scouting. Coaches were often just as guilty. Paul Brown, the legendary coach and general manager of the Cleveland Browns, had deep ties to Ohio State. His preference for Big Ten players became part of his team's DNA. He trusted them for their discipline and football intellect. Yet his bias created tension within his staff and roster. Players from rival schools like Michigan or Notre Dame often felt they had to work twice as hard to earn his respect. Brown's methods were brilliant, but his worldview was shaped by the rivalries of his youth. In the 1970s, as college football's television presence grew, so did the egos attached to its programs. Scouts no longer judged players only on their college performance, but also on the brand they represented. A player from Alabama or Texas came with national exposure and fan recognition. This shaped marketing decisions as much as roster ones. Owners began pressuring their football operations to draft marketable names from famous programs, especially if those players came from colleges aligned with their own regional fan bases. A New York team might favor an Eastern powerhouse. A California team would chase Pac-8 stars. The logic was simple but short-sighted. College loyalties sold tickets. The New York Giants of the late 1960s and early 1970s became a case study in how that thinking could backfire. Several of their front office executives were alumni of Northeastern schools, and they consistently overlooked players from the South. Believing the college systems there were too simplistic, they passed on numerous Southern talents who later became all-pros elsewhere. Meanwhile, their own draft picks, selected more for familiarity than fit, struggled to adapt to the professional game. What should have been a rebuild became a slow decay rooted in intellectual prejudice disguised as football philosophy. The irony was that some of the very scouts who made those biased calls had once suffered from similar treatment. Many were former college players who had been judged harshly in the draft process themselves. Yet when given power, they perpetuated the same cycle. It wasn't pure malice, it was tradition. In their minds, the college rivalries that had defined their playing days were still valid markers of character. A player from a rival school wasn't just competition. He was an embodiment of everything they had once fought against. In a sport built on loyalty, that sentiment ran deep. The draft, theoretically the fairest tool in professional sports, had become an emotional minefield. A team's success could hinge not only on talent evaluation, but on whether its decision-makers could set aside the ghosts of their college pasts. Many couldn't. Stories circulated quietly among players. A Georgia halfback would claim he was passed over by a scout who had played for Florida. A Penn State linebacker would say he never got a call from a coach who had once lost to him in a bowl game. Most of these tales were anecdotal, but the pattern was undeniable. The personal became professional. By the mid-1970s, as the league modernized its scouting approach, a new generation of executives began to recognize the damage this culture had caused. They sought to implement standardized grading systems and neutral evaluation criteria, removing the human bias that had long dominated draft rooms. Yet even then, the underlying emotions never fully disappeared. The draft board was still a battlefield, and each scout's ranking was shaped by a lifetime of experiences that numbers could never erase. The emergence of scouting combines in the late 1970s began to expose these discrepancies. Players from lesser-known programs began outperforming the so-called elite recruits, forcing teams to confront their own biases. But the old mindset lingered. A player's college still carried symbolic weight, even when the stopwatch told a different story. In the minds of many executives, winning traditions equaled winning players, and rivalries remained shorthand for trust and suspicion. When looking back on that era, it becomes clear that the NFL's early decades of drafting were not just about football talent. They were about memory, identity, and pride. The scouts who roamed the country with notepads and grainy film reels were carrying their own histories with them. Every evaluation was a small act of allegiance. Every selection, a quiet reaffirmation of loyalty to where they came from. The college rivalries that had once fueled the heart of American football had followed them into boardrooms and war rooms, shaping rosters in ways fans could never see. And even as analytics, technology, and film study have transformed the modern draft, the emotional DNA of those early years remains embedded in the sport. The biases that once led men to choose loyalty over logic still echo, if only faintly, in every draft room. The NFL was built not just on athleticism and money, but on memory. And memory, once born in rivalry, rarely fades. When Vince Lombardi arrived in Green Bay in 1959, professional football was still clinging to its collegiate roots. Teams were divided not only by geography, but by the cultural loyalties of their staffs. Many coaches still carried college banners in their offices, kept ties with their alma maters, and drafted players based on the same rivalries that had defined their youth. Lombardi entered this environment with the intent to impose order. He believed in merit, not memory. He believed football, at its highest level, had to shed the emotional hangovers of campus competition. Yet even he, the most disciplined of men, would find that the ghosts of college feuds were not so easily exorcised. Lombardi was a product of Fordham University. It's a small Jesuit school in New York City, better known for its 7 blocks of granite line than its championships. That identity shaped him. He was not from the dominant college programs of his era. He had watched from the sidelines as the Notre Dames, Michigans, and Alabamas of the world claimed all the glory. That distance gave him perspective. When he took over the Packers, he refused to indulge the favoritism that had plagued the league. He scouted from everywhere, demanded character over pedigree, and told his assistants that he did not care where a man came from, so long as he could play the game the right way. It was an ideal rooted in fairness, but it also placed him directly at odds with the culture he inherited. The league in the 1950s had been built by coaches who were, in many cases, former college assistants. They had brought their habits with them. A man who had coached at Alabama trusted the SEC pipeline. A man from Ohio State looked to the Big Ten. That regionalism was comfortable. It gave the sport a sense of continuity with its amateur past. But Lombardi wanted professionalism, not nostalgia. He famously said that his players did not play for a school or a town, they played for each other. It was his attempt to rewrite the emotional code of football itself. Yet even Lombardi could not completely escape the influence of college identity. His earliest years as an assistant with the New York Giants exposed him to the lingering tensions between coaches who had come from rival programs. The staff meetings often devolved into subtle arguments about which college system produced better players. When the Giants drafted players from Southern schools, some assistants from the North voiced quiet skepticism about their discipline. When they drafted from the North, others complained about their toughness. Lombardi learned to navigate those divisions, but he never forgot how corrosive they were. When he took command in Green Bay, he built his team like a fortress of discipline. Practices were militarized. Mistakes were met with silence and stare, not scolding. Every detail was measured, and yet the biases that surrounded him remained alive in the league offices and scouting circles. Lombardi's rise coincided with a generational turnover among coaches. Men like Tom Landry, Hank Stram, and George Allen were coming of age as leaders. Each of them faced the same struggle: how to create professional systems in a sport still infected by collegiate emotion. Landry, a Texan through and through, carried the mark of Southern football's pride. His Cowboys would come to represent the modern, efficient, corporate future of the game. But in his early years, he was battling not just opponents, but perceptions. Northern executives viewed his approach as regional experimentation, not innovation. Hank Stram, whose career blossomed with the Kansas City Chiefs, fought the same battle on another front. His belief in creativity and showmanship clashed with the conservative ethos inherited from the old college powerhouses. Each of these men, in their own way, was trying to purge football of the ghosts that had defined it. Still, even in the Lombardi era, the old rivalries shaped how teams operated. When Green Bay scouted the draft, their reports were full of language borrowed from college debates. Big Ten discipline and SEC toughness were shorthand for character traits, not factual evaluations. Lombardi despised such labels. He would cross out those words in reports and demand specifics. To him, toughness was not regional, it was moral. It was learned through repetition and expectation, not birthplace or alma mater. His approach began to influence others, but it also exposed just how deeply rooted the old biases remained. The 1960s were a period of cultural upheaval in America, and football mirrored that transformation. The civil rights movement challenged long-held regional assumptions, including those within sports. Southern schools began integrating, and suddenly the player pool expanded beyond the old pipelines. The NFL could no longer rely on narrow regional scouting, and Lombardi was among the first to embrace that change. He judged players by performance and discipline, not race or college affiliation. It was revolutionary, but it also isolated him from peers who clung to the past. Many front offices remained suspicious of players from newly integrated programs, preferring the comfort of familiar traditions. Lombardi's defiance of that mindset became part of his legend. Behind closed doors, he often clashed with team executives and scouts who wanted to lean into college reputations. He had no patience for nostalgia. When told that a certain school always produced good linemen, Lombardi would reply that schools did not block, men did. His insistence on individuality marked a turning point in how the league thought about talent. Still, the transformation was uneven. Other teams continued to build their rosters with the same old formulas, drawing lines between North and South, East and Midwest. The professional league was still a mosaic of campus colors. Even Lombardi's success could not fully erase the old culture. His Packers won championships with players from a wide range of schools, proving that diversity of background could create unity of purpose. Yet the moment he stepped away, the league seemed to relapse into its old patterns. Younger coaches, eager to replicate his success, misunderstood his method. They mimicked his authority, but not his objectivity. They believed the key to winning lay in control, not in fairness. And so, the bias simply changed form. Instead of regional loyalty, it became personal loyalty to coaching trees, to familiar systems, to former players who became assistants. The roots of tribalism remained, only transplanted from college pride to professional lineage. Lombardi's attempt to professionalize the sport did succeed in one crucial way. It elevated the image of the coach from mentor to executive. He made coaching a profession rather than a continuation of collegiate tutelage. His playbooks were sacred documents, his meetings, studies in human psychology. He insisted that respect, not rivalry, should guide the sports culture. And yet, in the process, he exposed how fragile professionalism really was. The same men who preached discipline were often ruled by sentiment. The same organizations that claimed objectivity still hired based on familiarity. When Lombardi left Green Bay and later coached in Washington, he brought the same ethos with him. His Washington players spoke of the same precision, the same expectations, the same rejection of favoritism. But even he could sense the undercurrent of resistance. The NFL was evolving into a league of personalities, college legends turned professional stars, each carrying fan bases that traced back to campus rivalries. Lombardi understood that the public loved that connection, even if it undermined the professionalism he sought. The league's marketing leaned into it, using college loyalties to sell tickets and television packages. The tribalism he had fought to neutralize became a commercial tool. In the end, Lombardi's battle was not against individual schools or regions, but against sentiment itself. He wanted a league governed by principle, not passion. Yet football, by nature, was a game of emotion. The same energy that made men loyal to their alma maters made them play harder, hit stronger, and believe deeper. Lombardi could channel that energy, but he could not erase it. His Green Bay dynasty proved that professionalism could coexist with passion, but only under the control of an extraordinary leader. When he was gone, the balance tilted again, and the old ghosts returned. His legacy, however, endures in a more subtle form. Modern football's obsession with discipline, preparation, and system all trace back to his attempt to draw a straight line through the chaos. It is fitting that the championship trophy bears his name. The Lombardi Trophy symbolizes mastery over emotion, but it also stands as a reminder of the struggle that defined his era, the battle to turn a sport born of rivalry into a profession built on respect. Lombardi built that foundation, but the cracks of old loyalties still run beneath it, faint but unbroken. In the mid-1960s, professional football began to encounter a new type of cultural collision. Joe Namath, quarterback of the New York Jets, arrived in the league carrying not just talent, but an attitude that was unmistakably Southern. He had grown up in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, and honed his skills at the University of Alabama under the legendary Paul Bryant. At Alabama, football was religion and the pride of the South, a reflection of a region defined by resilience and confidence. Namath embodied that spirit. His arrival in the NFL was more than a rookie entering a professional system. It was the introduction of a regional identity into a league still divided along cultural lines. Namath's confidence was visible from the start. He walked into locker rooms with a swagger that was both magnetic and polarizing. Veterans from Northern and Midwestern programs sometimes viewed his style as arrogance. They were used to a professional ethos shaped by discipline and deference, a culture that valued performance over personality. Namath's charm, his style, his willingness to speak openly to the media challenged those expectations. Yet for fans and younger players, his confidence was electrifying. It signaled a new era, one in which the personality of the player mattered as much as his statistics on the field. The Southern identity Namath carried was rooted in the football culture of the Southeastern Conference. Players from the SC were taught that confidence was inseparable from skill. They were celebrated not only for their physical ability, but for the bravado that accompanied it. Namath's coaches at Alabama emphasized that a quarterback must command attention, project certainty, and inspire belief even when the odds seemed impossible. Those lessons translated immediately to the professional level. He did not simply play the game, he performed it. He created a spectacle that demanded recognition and, at times, forced confrontation. This regional confidence had tangible consequences in professional locker rooms. Some teammates saw Namath as a disruptor. Northern veterans whose understanding of football authority came from rigid, hierarchical systems interpreted his swagger as a challenge to their own legitimacy. Discussions about play calling, strategy, and leadership sometimes became tense. Namath's Southern upbringing, with its emphasis on individuality and pride, clashed with cultures that prioritized conformity and respect for established order. The friction was subtle but real, influencing both morale and team dynamics. The Jets themselves were an emblem of the American football expansion, a franchise from the upstart American Football League. They had to compete for attention and legitimacy against the more established NFL teams. Namath's persona offered a solution. His Southern charisma, combined with extraordinary ability, gave the Jets a national spotlight. He became the first quarterback in the AFL to truly capture media attention across the country, transforming the perception of what it meant to be a professional football player. Yet that spotlight came at a cost. The cultural tension between Northern and Southern football persisted, even as the Jets climbed the league standings. Namath's style was not only personal, but symbolic. The 1960s were a time of social and cultural upheaval in America, and football reflected that transformation. Southern pride, once constrained by regional boundaries, now had a national stage. Namath, as a high-profile player, embodied the intersection of regional identity and celebrity. His fame allowed Southern football culture to assert itself beyond its geographic origins, challenging the dominance of Northern traditions that had long shaped professional play. The NFL was becoming a national arena, and the old divisions could no longer remain local. The quarterback position itself magnified the effect of Namath's Southern confidence. Unlike linemen or linebackers, a quarterback is both leader and symbol. Every pass, every decision, every gesture carries psychological weight. Namath's attitude made him an anchor for fans and a lightning rod for opponents. For teammates, it required adjustment. Players who had been accustomed to leaders who led quietly and demanded respect through action alone had to recalibrate. They could not ignore Namath, nor could they easily embrace him. The locker room became a microcosm of the cultural dialogue happening across the country. Namath's early seasons illustrated both the power and the peril of regional identity. On the field, he brought Alabama-style confidence to the Jets' offense, leading daring drives and executing throws that seemed improbable. His athleticism and flair drew attention to the team and validated the Southern approach to leadership in professional football. Off the field, however, the same confidence created friction with management and veterans, particularly those from programs steeped in Northern pragmatism. Coaches had to manage not just X's and O's, but the cultural weight Namath carried with him. The most vivid example came during the 1968 season. The Jets were preparing for a critical matchup against the Oakland Raiders. Namath, comfortable in his Southern persona, approached the game with his characteristic bravado. Northern teammates, concerned with preparation and protocol, questioned some of his public statements and media engagements. Tension simmered beneath the surface. Yet, when the game began, Namath's leadership through action silenced skeptics. The Jets executed their game plan with precision, and Namath's passing demonstrated that Southern confidence could translate into professional efficacy. The result was a victory, but it did not erase the underlying cultural friction that continued to exist within the locker room. Namath's influence extended beyond the team. The AFL, and eventually the NFL after the merger, observed how regional identity could shape the perception of talent and leadership. Southern programs, once considered secondary to Northern and Eastern powerhouses, gained credibility. Executives began to acknowledge that character, charisma, and confidence were as important as raw skill. The national spotlight forced a reassessment of old biases that had dictated scouting, drafting, and player evaluation for decades. Namath had not only challenged locker room hierarchies, but the league itself. Media played a critical role in amplifying these tensions. Sports writers, broadcasters, and magazine editors were captivated by Namath's persona. His Southern charm and flamboyance became a story in itself, shaping public perception of the AFL and, by extension, professional football. Fans began to associate the Jets with boldness, daring, and a willingness to break traditional molds. Northern audiences, accustomed to the disciplined narratives of Midwestern and Eastern programs, were forced to confront a different style of football leadership. The sport, once primarily regional, had become a national spectacle where cultural identity was inseparable from athletic performance. The Namath era also highlighted the generational shift in football culture. Younger players admired his confidence, even if veterans resisted it. Southern quarterbacks were no longer anomalies in a league dominated by Northern conventions. Their success depended not just on talent, but on their ability to assert leadership through personality. Namath demonstrated that regional identity, when combined with national exposure, could challenge the entrenched professional systems that had governed the NFL for decades. Ultimately, Namath's career was a study in how professional football absorbed, reflected, and sometimes struggled with the weight of regional identity. He showed that Southern confidence could coexist with professional rigor, but only if managed carefully. His presence forced coaches, teammates, and executives to reconcile the emotional legacies of college rivalries with the practical demands of professional play. The national spotlight he occupied accelerated the league's evolution from a collection of regional traditions into a unified cultural institution. Yet it did not erase the underlying divisions that had been inherited from collegiate rivalries. In retrospect, Namath was more than a quarterback. He was a symbol of a cultural negotiation taking place within the NFL. His Southern swagger brought flair, confidence, and controversy. It exposed latent biases and demanded adaptation from a league still learning to balance personality with professionalism. Every play he executed, every interview he gave, every step he took into the national consciousness was a lesson in the power of identity in American football. Namath's journey illustrated that the professional game was not just about strategy or physical skill. It was about heritage, regional culture, and the ability to navigate a landscape shaped as much by emotion as by talent. Professional football has always been a business of continuity, of progression from college glory to professional achievement. Yet for fans, that transition was never seamless. The allegiance cultivated on Saturdays lingered like a ghost over Sunday afternoons. Even as the NFL rose to prominence, it inherited the emotional residue of decades of college loyalty. Stadiums filled not only with support for professional teams, but with the unspoken question of whether the men in uniform carried the honor of their alma maters. The invisible emotional line between Saturday and Sunday haunted the league, shaping its narratives, its rivalries, and its cultural resonance. In the 1950s and 1960s, when the NFL was still establishing its identity, newspapers frequently referenced a player's college passed alongside his professional performance. A touchdown pass was not just a professional achievement, it was proof of the player's continued loyalty to the school that had formed him. Fans knew every history, every rivalry, and every bitter defeat. A Cleveland Browns supporter might quietly mourn the Ohio State player on a rival team, even as the man threw for hundreds of yards on Sunday. This dual allegiance created a subtle tension, a way in which college rivalries continue to echo in professional contexts. For decades, the North versus South debate persisted in the stands. In many cases, fans rooted for their city's professional team while simultaneously feeling a deep affinity for their college. The fan from Pittsburgh might cheer for a local pro star, yet his heart remained tethered to Notre Dame, Penn State, or a local university program. This duality created a layered form of fandom. When a former college star faced his alma mater's rival on Sunday, the emotional stakes were magnified. Every game became a complex negotiation between personal history and civic loyalty. Players understood this tension more than anyone. Many carried letters, memorabilia, or reminders of their college careers into their professional locker rooms. Some fans expressed dissatisfaction when their favorite alumni played for rival cities. The athlete, once a symbol of campus pride, became a conduit for nostalgia, expectation, and sometimes resentment. In interviews and personal accounts, players from the 1960s and 1970s spoke of fans who would boo them not for poor performance, but for betraying perceived college allegiances. The professional stage was always overlaid with the emotional geography of college football. This phenomenon was not limited to the marquee quarterbacks or star linemen. Every position, from kickers to defensive backs, carried the weight of collegiate history. A linebacker who had spent 4 years in Alabama brought the cultural pride of the Deep South into the national spotlight. Even if he joined a team in New York or Minnesota, fans in his home state followed his professional career as an extension of their own identity. Victory was both his and theirs. Conversely, mistakes or losses were amplified, perceived as failures not just in the professional arena, but in the larger narrative of college loyalty. The NFL's rise in television during the 1960s and 1970s intensified the effect. Suddenly, fans across the country could watch their former college stars compete against other professionals every week. Networks highlighted the college backgrounds of players in commentary and graphics. Viewers were reminded constantly of their history and their emotional investment. A Southeastern Conference hero now playing in Chicago became a story not only of adaptation, but of continuity. Saturday and Sunday were no longer separate. The college game bled into the professional spectacle. This influence extended to coaching as well. Many coaches manage players according to their alma mater's traditions, whether intentionally or unconsciously. A head coach from a northern university might favor former colleagues or players from familiar conferences. Fans often interpreted these choices as loyalty to a system rather than to the team itself. The perception of favoritism reinforced the narrative that professional teams were extensions of college rivalries. Strategies, personnel decisions, and even media messaging were sometimes informed by the lingering ghosts of campus identity. The dynamic also shaped media coverage. Sports writers frequently used college affiliations to frame professional stories. Headlines might read, for example, Alabama graduate leads Jets past Raiders, or Michigan man commands Bears defense. These narratives reminded readers that players were more than employees of a professional franchise. They were ambassadors of regional and institutional pride. The commentary created a lens through which fans viewed professional competition, keeping the Saturday spirit alive in Sunday arenas. The intensity of fan emotion sometimes crossed into rivalry-driven hostility. Letters to newspapers from the 1960s often criticized professional teams for recruiting players from rival colleges. accusing management of undermining regional honor. Stadiums were venues not only for sport, but for the ongoing negotiation of identity. Fans evaluated performance through the prism of college tradition. A quarterback's mistake was not simply a team error. It was a symbolic loss for the institution that had formed him. In interviews decades later, several players reflected on the subtle but constant pressure to honor their college identities. One linebacker from the Midwest recalled that his early professional career was defined by the need to navigate these dual loyalties. Fans expected him to play not only for his city, but for the region that had shaped him. Every sack, interception, or tackle carried weight far beyond the scoreboard. Even teammates were influenced, often discussing college allegiances as if they were ongoing matters of professional consequence. This duality created a psychological dimension that persists to this day. Players learned early that they carried history in their uniforms. They were judged not only for performance, but for adherence to the expectations of multiple fan bases. The transition from student-athlete to professional was therefore never fully personal. It was an inherited responsibility. The invisible line between Saturday and Sunday was a measure of loyalty, reputation, and identity. Professional football was, in many ways, haunted by its collegiate past. The impact on team culture was equally profound. Coaches had to reconcile the presence of former rivals within the same locker room. Northern and Southern graduates played side by side, each carrying pride, resentment, and the mental residue of decades of competition. The professional game required them to collaborate. Yet the emotional legacy of college rivalries often dictated who assumed leadership roles and who was questioned. Practices were filled not only with physical drills, but with unspoken assessments of character, temperament, and allegiance. Fans, players, and coaches all negotiated this invisible line in their own ways. Some embraced it, seeing professional games as an opportunity to resolve lingering debates from college days. Others resisted, striving to create a new identity separate from regional and institutional histories. The NFL itself had to balance these dynamics, marketing the league as a national enterprise while acknowledging that its appeal depended on deeply rooted emotional connections. The challenge was enduring. To unify a sport whose players, fans, and culture were still inextricably linked to the colleges that had created them. The emotional weight of Saturday haunts Sunday became a defining feature of professional football culture. It explained why certain rivalries carried exceptional intensity. It illuminated why fans could remain loyal to a City S team, yet simultaneously critique the actions of individual players. It shaped the league's public perception, its draft strategies, and even its internal hierarchies. Professional football was no longer simply about wins and losses. It was about continuity, identity, and the unresolved loyalties of an earlier era. By the 1970s, the influence of college allegiances persisted despite league expansion, televised coverage, and increasing national attention. Regional pride had become a commodity, a tool for engagement, yet it retained its emotional power. Fans still measured players by the standards set on Saturdays, decades earlier. The invisible line between the two worlds remained strong, a reminder that the NFL, for all its progress, had inherited an emotional architecture for older than the league itself. The resonance of this dual loyalty can be traced to every aspect of the game. It shaped coaching decisions, influenced locker room hierarchies, and guided media narratives. Fans engaged with the sport through a lens of historical awareness, often feeling a sense of connection that transcended the professional teams themselves. Professional football had grown into a national spectacle, yet its identity was still haunted by the loyalties of college Saturdays. That haunting became a force, subtle but relentless, defining the character of the league in ways that no scoreboard or statistics could measure. In professional football, the influence of legendary coaches has always extended far beyond playbooks and formations. They carry with them the philosophies, values, and identities forged in college programs that had long histories of triumph and defeat. These men became the conduits for campus traditions in the professional arena. and their arrival in the NFL often created identity clashes that shaped team culture, fan perception, and even the evolution of the league itself. The narrative of professional football in the mid-20th century cannot be told without examining how coaches transplanted collegiate rivalries and philosophies into a new and unforgiving professional landscape. Vince Lombardi, Paul Brown, Tom Landry, and George Allen were among the most influential architects of this era, each representing a distinct collegiate-formed philosophy. Lombardi's discipline, precision, and moral rigor reflected his experiences at Fordham University, where the emphasis on preparation and unity formed the backbone of his coaching ethos. Paul Brown's systematic approach, cultivated at Ohio State, and with the Cleveland Browns, emphasized intelligence, structure, and meticulous execution. Landry's cerebral style, shaped by Southern football traditions and his time at Texas, emphasized strategic innovation and adaptability. Each coach brought a worldview cultivated in a specific cultural and regional context, and each attempted to translate it to professional football with varying degrees of success. The impact of these transplanted philosophies was immediate. Players entering professional locker rooms encountered not only new rules and faster competition, but also deeply entrenched expectations about identity, loyalty, and conduct. A quarterback drafted from a northern powerhouse like Michigan might find himself at odds with a coach steeped in Southern philosophy, and vice versa. These differences were subtle yet potent, affecting communication, leadership dynamics, and ultimately performance. Players had to navigate not just the physical demands of the sport, but the social and cultural currents that their coaches brought with them. The tension was particularly pronounced in integrated locker rooms where regional identity and college philosophy collided. In the 1960s and 1970s, the NFL expanded rapidly, incorporating teams from across the country with increasingly diverse rosters. Coaches who carried strong collegiate philosophies were often challenged to unify players with different cultural backgrounds, playing styles, and expectations. Paul Brown, for example, had little patience for Southern showmanship, favoring consistency and repetition over flair. His Cleveland Browns were efficient machines, but the rigid philosophy occasionally alienated players accustomed to the more expressive, individualistic style of Southern football. Lombardi, in contrast, sought to channel emotion into cohesion. His Packers were a fusion of different regional identities, yet he demanded that all players submit to a shared standard of discipline. Even so, the ghosts of college rivalries persisted. Players who had once been adversaries on Saturday fields carried those memories into Lombardi's practice sessions. In interviews, former players recalled that early team meetings often involved subtle testing of loyalties and character, a psychological negotiation as much as a strategic preparation. Lombardi's genius lay not in erasing these differences, but in directing them toward collective purpose. George Allen of the Washington Redskins introduced another dimension to the translation of campus philosophy. Allen's professional teams reflected his obsession with veteran experience and discipline. He valued players who had been rigorously trained in college programs that emphasized responsibility and accountability. His preference for certain college backgrounds created tension with both management and players, particularly rookies who had been stars in programs with a more celebratory approach to talent. Allen's methodology was a professionalization of collegiate intensity, yet it reinforced the very divides he hoped to mitigate. Coach's influence extended beyond personality and philosophy to operational decisions. Drafting, training regimens, and positional assignments were frequently informed by a coach's collegiate biases. Northern coaches favored Big Ten linemen, known for toughness and consistency. Southern coaches sought players from SEC programs, valuing instinct and flair. These decisions often created identity clashes within the same professional roster. Players judged by one standard in college were suddenly reevaluated through the lens of another, and coaches had to manage both performance and cultural integration simultaneously. The media amplified these dynamics. Newspapers, magazines, and television commentators frequently highlighted a coach's college pedigree. framing professional decisions within historical rivalries. Headlines would reference former allegiances and perceived philosophical biases, reinforcing the narrative that the NFL was not only a competitive league, but a continuation of intercollegiate cultural warfare. Fans absorbed these narratives, sometimes celebrating and sometimes criticizing coaching decisions based on their own allegiance to particular colleges or regions. The public perception of a coach became inseparable from his college-informed philosophy. Even celebrated innovations were viewed through this lens. Tom Landry's flex defense, introduced with the Dallas Cowboys, was praised for its strategic brilliance but also interpreted as a reflection of Southern intelligence and adaptability. Coaches were scrutinized not only for results but for the cultural origins of their methods. Critics and supporters alike debated whether successes and failures were products of talent, preparation, or the philosophical foundations brought from college programs. Every professional game carried echoes of campus strategy, and every coaching decision became a battleground of identity. The tension between tradition and modernization played out vividly in team interactions. Some players resisted their coaches' collegiate philosophies, viewing them as outdated or overly rigid. Others embraced them as frameworks that lent structure to the chaos of professional play. The duality created both conflict and cohesion. The locker room became a microcosm of the broader cultural negotiation within the NFL. Coaches, aware of their authority, but also of their dependence on player buy-in, had to balance enforcement with adaptation, translating personal philosophy into functional team culture. Not all experiments succeeded. Coaches who attempted to impose a single college-derived ideology on a roster often encountered resistance, fractured cohesion, and underperformance. Players who had been nurtured in different systems brought expectations that clashed with imposed norms. Those who could not reconcile their personal identity with the coach's philosophy struggled to adapt. Yet the attempt itself illustrates the powerful and persistent influence of collegiate culture on professional football. The league, even as it evolved, remained tethered to the identities cultivated on campuses decades earlier. The cumulative effect of these coaches' philosophies created a professional landscape rich with diversity, but also fraught with friction. Each team's identity was shaped as much by the values and biases of its coaching staff as by the performance of its players. Rivalries persisted not only between teams, but within rosters, as the cultural legacies of different colleges collided. The NFL became a league where strategic brilliance and interpersonal diplomacy were inseparable. Coaches were tasked with guiding players on the field, while simultaneously negotiating inherited identities off the field. Ultimately, the era of coaches importing campus philosophies into the NFL reveals the depth of football's cultural roots. Professional football did not develop in isolation. It evolved from a network of colleges, rivalries, and regional identities that had dominated American sport for decades. Legendary coaches served as both conduits and arbiters, translating these influences into professional contexts. Their successes and failures highlight the enduring complexity of the NFL, a league whose competitive excellence has always been intertwined with the emotional and cultural legacies of its collegiate past. The legacy of these coaches is profound. They demonstrated that professional football could be elevated through disciplined philosophy, while acknowledging the emotional weight of college traditions. They showed that leadership was about navigating complexity, reconciling disparate identities, and channeling passion into performance. Yet their era also revealed the challenges inherent in a sport still haunted by its origins. The identity clashes they managed, sometimes successfully and sometimes not, underscore the enduring impact of collegiate culture on the professional game. In reflecting on this period, it becomes clear that the NFL's growth was inseparable from the values, biases, and strategies carried over from colleges. The most influential coaches understood that winning required more than athletic skill. It demanded psychological insight, cultural sensitivity, and the ability to translate personal philosophy into collective achievement. The history of the league is thus inseparable from the history of its coaches. Its Crusades brought both clarity and conflict to professional football. Their efforts were monumental, but the complexity they navigated reminds us that the ghosts of Saturday are never far from Sunday. Professional football is a game of strategy, strength, and skill, but it is also a theater of human relationships. Within every team exists a network of alliances, loyalties, and rivalries that often mirror the allegiances players carried from their college days. Locker rooms, in particular, have historically been spaces where the invisible lines of college rivalry manifest with clarity. Trust, betrayal, and silence govern interactions, sometimes shaping team performance more than any playbook or practice session. These dynamics were especially pronounced in the mid-20th century, when professional rosters were populated almost entirely by former collegiate stars, each carrying the psychological residue of campus competition. One of the most documented cases of such tension occurred with the 1967 Dallas Cowboys. The team had integrated players from both northern and southern programs, and the differences in culture and approach were immediately apparent. Rookies from Big Ten and Ivy League programs brought a methodical, analytical approach to preparation. They valued discipline, repetition, and quiet authority. Southern players, many from SEC programs, emphasized intuition, confidence, and emotional leadership. At first, these differences created friction during practice. Huddles often became arenas of subtle competition, with players measuring each other against the standards instilled during their college years. Veteran players frequently acted as arbiters of these divisions. Linebackers who had captained their college teams assumed informal authority, expecting deference from younger teammates. This hierarchy was not always aligned with professional tenure. A first-year player from a rival college could be perceived as a threat because of the reputation of his alma mater. Coaches were aware of these dynamics, but often allowed them to exist, believing that a certain level of tension would sharpen performance. The risk, however, was that unresolved conflict could spiral into deep rifts that affected trust, communication, and cohesion on game day. In interviews decades later, several Cowboys veterans recalled the way silence functioned as a weapon. If a player had faced a rival college star on Saturdays for years, lingering resentment could manifest as deliberate exclusion. Passing routes might be ignored during practice, blocking assignments misaligned, and informal mentorship withheld. The professional game demanded collaboration. Yet the psychological legacy of college rivalry sometimes undermined the very structure that coaches sought to build. For the athletes, it was a delicate balance. They had to reconcile the competitive instincts honed in college with the collective goals of their professional team. The New York Jets during the late 1960s provide another illustrative example. Joe Namath, a former Alabama star, commanded both respect and wariness. Northern teammates, particularly those from Ivy League programs, were sometimes skeptical of Namath's approach. Off the field, interactions were marked by cautious observation. In team meetings, players would speak measuredly, avoiding direct challenges while signaling loyalty to their own backgrounds. The unspoken rules of engagement reflected centuries of intercollegiate rivalry, demonstrating that professional football had inherited not only tactics, but deeply ingrained cultural frameworks. Trust, in particular, was fragile. Teammates who had once faced each other as fierce competitors on college Saturdays carried those histories into professional huddles. A lineman might hesitate in protecting a quarterback from a rival school during critical plays. A wide receiver could be less willing to support a running back whose collegiate team had been a bitter adversary. Coaches reported that performance issues often traced back not to physical skill, but to these invisible lines of division. The locker room became a crucible, testing not just athletic ability, but emotional maturity and the capacity to transcend inherited rivalries. Silence was a form of communication that could both protect and punish. Players would deliberately withhold information, avoid eye contact during drills, or speak only when necessary. These behaviors were subtle yet powerful, creating an environment in which cohesion required constant negotiation. Veteran players frequently acted as informal mediators, interpreting intent and managing conflicts, but the process was never perfect. The NFL was a league still negotiating its identity. And the persistence of college loyalties ensured that some level of division was inevitable. The psychological toll of these rifts was significant. Players often reported feelings of isolation, frustration, and anxiety stemming from the tension between past and present loyalties. A quarterback who could not fully rely on his linemen due to unspoken rivalries faced the increased risk of injury and performance decline. A running back navigating subtle sabotage might hesitate in crucial moments, compromising the team's strategy. These dynamics illustrate that professional football, while ostensibly a contest of physical prowess, is equally a contest of human psychology, heavily influenced by inherited histories. Documented accounts also reveal moments of betrayal, often small but consequential. A wide receiver from Ohio State might fail to adjust to a blocking assignment because a former rival from Michigan was in position. A defensive back could miscommunicate during a coverage assignment because he had once been outmaneuvered by a college opponent now on the same professional roster. Coaches sometimes dismissed these incidents as rookie mistakes or lapses in focus, but players recognized them as echoes of past rivalries asserting themselves in new contexts. The professional field was both a continuation and a transformation of college competition. Despite these challenges, moments of reconciliation and adaptation occurred. Over time, shared goals and repeated collaboration could override the inherited loyalties that initially divided players. Veterans would mentor newcomers, emphasizing the primacy of professional identity over collegiate allegiance. Success on the field required trust to be rebuilt daily, often through repetition, accountability, and the unglamorous work of team bonding. When teams managed to navigate these psychological landscapes successfully, they often experienced remarkable cohesion and resilience, translating the energy of past rivalries into collective strength. The Los Angeles Rams in the early 1970s offer an example of such adaptation. Players from rival colleges eventually recognized that professional survival and team success required setting aside inherited animosities. Communication improved, drills were executed more efficiently, and individual brilliance was harnessed for the collective. Coaches credited these transformations to intentional leadership and the natural maturation of players, confronting the reality that past rivalries could not dictate professional outcomes. Yet even in these success stories, the invisible line from college never fully disappeared. It remained as a psychological backdrop, subtly informing decisions, interactions, and emotional responses. Fans, too, were aware of these dynamics. Newspapers and magazines reported internal tensions, often framing them as drama that amplified the appeal of professional football. Allegiances were parsed with reference to college histories, and commentary frequently highlighted perceived friction between former rivals. Audiences consumed the narrative of locker room rivalry alongside the spectacle of the game itself, creating a cultural feedback loop that reinforced the emotional inheritance of collegiate competition. Saturday's conflicts became Sunday's storylines. The persistence of locker room rifts demonstrates the depth of football's cultural inheritance. Professional teams were never merely collections of athletes. They were arenas in which the weight of college identity intersected with professional ambition. Trust, betrayal, and silence were not peripheral concerns, but central mechanisms by which inherited rivalries influenced outcomes. The NFL, in absorbing these dynamics, became a league defined not only by physical performance, but by the human capacity to navigate complex social legacies. Ultimately, locker room lines illustrate a fundamental truth about professional football. Success requires more than talent and strategy. It demands emotional intelligence, adaptability, and an understanding of the unseen histories each player brings to the team. Rivalries from college did not vanish upon entering the professional arena. They persisted as undercurrents, shaping relationships, influencing performance, and coloring the culture of the league. Teams that succeeded were those that could transform inherited conflict into cooperation, harnessing the intensity of past rivalries for present achievement. The enduring lesson is clear. Professional football is a human enterprise as much as a competitive one. The ghosts of college rivalries continue to inform behavior, strategy, and perception. Locker rooms, often described as centers of unity and preparation, were also crucibles of negotiation, where inherited loyalties and animosities had to be reconciled. Players learned to navigate these emotional terrains with skill equal to any physical technique. The NFL's growth and identity were deeply entwined with these inherited dynamics, ensuring that Saturday's lessons continued to resonate on Sunday for decades to come. The advent of televised football transformed the sport in ways that few could have anticipated. College games, once confined to local communities and radio broadcasts, suddenly reached living rooms across the country. Networks showcased storied rivalries, chronicling decades of competition, triumph, and heartbreak. Fans who had once lived only within the geographic confines of their college loyalties were now part of a national audience, witnessing rivalries unfold in real time. This exposure did more than entertain. It instilled tribalism, the kind of deep-seated allegiance that would eventually define professional football fandom as much as it did college campuses. Television allowed the intensity of Saturday games to follow players into the NFL. When former college stars entered professional ranks, audiences carried memories of past contests with them. A fan who had cheered for Alabama against Auburn in the Iron Bowl, or for Michigan against Ohio State in a pivotal Big Ten matchup, could now observe those same players representing new cities in professional arenas. Commentary and pre-game analysis constantly referenced college backgrounds, reminding viewers of histories that were still emotionally charged. The narrative of rivalry did not fade with graduation. It was amplified by the broadcast medium. Networks quickly realized the value of this emotional connection. Televised games became more than athletic contests. They were spectacles, framed by the stories of the men on the field. Sports writers and commentators emphasized past victories and defeats, heightening anticipation for professional matchups. A quarterback who had defeated a particular rival in college might be introduced to viewers as a figure continuing an unresolved feud on a national stage. The storytelling created continuity between the college and professional game, fostering a sense of inherited conflict that shaped viewer engagement. The psychological effect on fans was profound. Tribal allegiance became a lens through which professional teams were evaluated. A fan of a northern university might resist supporting a professional team that included a southern rival, even if the player was performing exceptionally. Conversely, a southern fan might rally behind a player who represented the pride of their former campus, regardless of the city they now represented. Professional loyalty was often secondary to the enduring emotional investment in college identities. Television made these loyalties visible, widespread, and culturally influential. Televised college rivalries also shaped marketing strategies within the NFL. Teams recognized that a player's collegiate pedigree could be leveraged to attract fan engagement and media attention. Promotional materials, game previews, and commentary frequently highlighted these connections, reinforcing the narrative that professional football was a continuation of college warfare. The spectacle of the game became inseparable from the history of the athletes, creating a media ecosystem in which the past was as compelling as the present. The phenomenon of tribalism extended beyond the fan experience into the operational culture of the NFL. Team executives and coaches recognized that audiences were invested not only in wins and losses, but in the symbolic victories of former colleges. Draft decisions were sometimes framed in terms of rivalry resolution, as if securing a star from a rival program could serve as a psychological coup for the team's fan base. Marketing campaigns highlighted alumni from prestigious or historically competitive programs too, bolster ticket sales and television ratings. Television had not only brought the college game to a national audience, but it also woven its history into the identity of professional football. Players themselves were acutely aware of the heightened attention. They understood that every action on Sunday was scrutinized in the context of past Saturday contests. Quarterbacks, running backs, and linemen recognized that a misstep could resonate beyond team performance, reflecting on their collegiate legacy. Interviews with players from the 1960s and 1970s often reveal an awareness that televised coverage magnified the emotional stakes of the game. The league was no longer just a competitive platform. It was a stage upon which college histories were replayed and reinterpreted. The role of commentary cannot be overstated. Analysts framed games in ways that emphasized inherited rivalries, often citing previous college encounters as critical context for understanding professional matchups. The narrative of conflict and revenge became a recurring motif. When former college rivals faced each other in the NFL, the storylines often highlighted decades of unresolved competition. Fans were invited to witness not only a professional contest, but the continuation of deeply rooted historical narratives. Television transformed football into a medium of collective memory, where the past informed every play, decision, and outcome. Television also contributed to the nationalization of fan identity. In earlier decades, regional loyalties limited exposure to teams and players from distant states. Televised games broke down these geographic barriers, creating a national fan culture in which college identity became a primary axis of allegiance. Viewers across the country could follow the trajectory of players from their favorite college programs into the NFL, building enduring attachments that transcended city boundaries. Saturday rivalries became embedded within Sunday fandom, and professional football inherited a passionate, loyal, and often tribal audience. The commercialization of these narratives had lasting effects on the league. NFL franchises began to recognize the economic value of alumni followings. Stadium attendance, merchandise sales, and television ratings were influenced not only by local loyalty, but by the emotional investment in collegiate legacies. Rivalries from decades earlier continued to drive engagement, creating a feedback loop in which college histories became an indispensable component of professional marketing. The interplay between media, fans, and the league reinforced the persistence of Saturday's influence on Sunday. Television also heightened the pressure on players. A quarterback making his professional debut in front of a national audience carried not only the expectations of his team, but the weight of his college achievements. Mistakes were magnified. Celebrated performances were dissected, and every interaction on the field became part of a broader narrative. The emotional intensity of the game was amplified, creating a psychological landscape that mirrored, and sometimes intensified, the rivalries players had experienced in their formative years. This amplification affected locker room dynamics as well. Players understood that performance was observed through the lens of college history, influencing interactions with teammates, coaches, and the media. Trust had to be negotiated with the knowledge that past rivalries could resurface at any moment under the scrutiny of broadcast coverage. Professional success required both athletic excellence and the ability to navigate a socially and culturally complex environment, one in which television acted as a constant mediator and amplifier. The nationalization of fan identity through televised coverage also had consequences for league expansion. As the NFL grew, incorporating new teams in diverse markets, it carried with it the cultural baggage of college football. Rivalries, histories, and fan expectations traveled with players into new cities. Television served as the conduit, ensuring that professional games remained inseparable from the emotions and narratives cultivated over decades of collegiate competition. The league's identity was thus inseparable from the media landscape that had brought it to life in living rooms across America. Ultimately, the impact of television on tribalism in football demonstrates the inseparability of narrative, emotion, and performance. The NFL did not simply broadcast games, it broadcast history. Fans became lifelong adherents not only to professional teams, but to the legacies of the colleges that had formed the players. The invisible line between Saturday and Sunday was made visible, powerful, and enduring. The national audience became a participant in the ongoing story of rivalry, loyalty, and identity, ensuring that professional football remained haunted by the passions of the college game. television turned spectators into archivists of emotion, chroniclers of allegiance, and participants in a drama that stretched from campus fields to professional stadiums. The medium amplified tribalism, reinforced rivalries, and shaped the culture of fandom in ways that endure today. Professional football, as a consequence, is never purely about the present. It is a repository of past loyalties, a stage upon which the stories of college football continue to play out in front of millions. Saturday haunts Sunday, and television ensures that no rivalry is ever truly forgotten. The rivalry between the University of Florida Gators and Florida State Seminoles is one of the most storied in collegiate athletics. It carries with it a history of regional pride, personal vendettas, and emotional intensity that has persisted for decades. When players from these programs entered the NFL, the intensity of that rivalry did not dissipate. It followed them, manifesting in locker room tension, on-field confrontations, and personal feuds that became emblematic of how college competition could spill over into professional play. The Florida State rivalry provides a vivid case study of the emotional continuity between college and the NFL and highlights the enduring, psychological weight of intercollegiate competition. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a generation of players from both schools made the transition to the NFL. Quarterbacks, wide receivers, and defensive backs who had spent their formative athletic years entrenched in the culture of the rivalry carried deep-seated allegiances and grievances with them. On the professional field, these men were teammates, opponents, or sometimes both, and the memories of Iron Bowls and Sun Bowls informed every practice, meeting, and snap. What had once been a rivalry confined to state lines and college campuses now unfolded under the bright lights of national broadcast, carrying with it the weight of history and expectation. A particularly illustrative example involves two wide receivers who entered the league in the early 1990s. One had starred for the Gators and the other for the Seminoles. They were drafted by rival professional teams in the NFC and AFC, respectively. Early meetings in training camp were marked by heightened intensity. Practices became battlegrounds, not only for skill demonstration, but for psychological dominance. Coaches noticed the subtle ways in which each player anticipated and reacted to the other. They brought with them the patterns, habits, and grudges formed during countless collegiate confrontations. Every interaction carried the subtext of previous victories and losses, the unspoken record of battles fought on Saturdays long before professional careers began. Fans recognized these dynamics as well. Sports media highlighted the history between the players, framing games as extensions of their college rivalry. Headlines emphasized Florida versus Florida State Redux and Gator Knoll showdown in the pros. National audiences became aware that professional outcomes were inextricably linked to histories outside the NFL. Television amplified the significance of every pass, tackle, and touchdown, and the narrative of college rivalry remains central to the spectator experience. Professional performance was always viewed through the lens of college competition. On the field, the intensity manifested in precise, sometimes extreme ways. Defensive backs who had faced their former rivals in college anticipated tendencies, sometimes exploiting habits ingrained over years of rivalry preparation. Wide receivers adjusted their routes, remembering the coverage patterns they had learned when studying tape of previous opponents. The professional game was faster, more complex, and more strategic. But the psychological imprint of the Florida State rivalry persisted. Players adapted their strategies not just to opponents, but to the histories that shaped them. The psychological effect extended to team cohesion and locker room interactions. Players who had been fierce competitors in college had to navigate professional relationships that required mutual trust. The transition from adversary to teammate was not always seamless. Teammates from other programs noticed the heightened intensity and sometimes acted as mediators. Veteran leadership became crucial, helping to integrate players while acknowledging the lingering tension. The process was delicate. Trust had to be earned, and past grievances were never entirely erased. the lessons learned from college rivalry continued to influence professional social dynamics. The Gators and Seminoles case also illustrates how rivalry can affect recruitment, trades, and draft decisions. Scouts and executives were aware of these histories and occasionally factored them into personnel decisions. A player who had dominated in the Florida State rivalry might be seen as particularly valuable in a professional context because of the intensity and competitiveness instilled by these contests. Conversely, executives sometimes hesitated, fearing that the emotional baggage from college could disrupt professional locker room dynamics. The ripple effects of a single rivalry extended far beyond the field, influencing team strategy and composition. Specific incidents from the NFL era underscore the persistence of this rivalry. In one early 1990s matchup, two former college stars faced each other in a nationally televised game. A routine pass coverage escalated into a heated confrontation. Teammates and officials intervened to de-escalate the situation. But the intensity of the exchange reflected years of ingrained competition. Interviews later revealed that both players had carried personal memories of key plays, losses, and victories from their collegiate encounters. Professional performance was inseparable from the psychological and emotional history they brought with them. Coaches played an important role in managing these dynamics. They recognized that the intensity of college rivalry could be a double-edged sword. Channeling it effectively could enhance performance, motivate players, and energize fans. Mishandled, it could undermine cohesion, create internal conflict, and distract from team objectives. Professional leadership required an understanding not only of athletic skill, but also of the deep-rooted emotional landscapes of players. The Florida State rivalry exemplifies how the personal history of players could both enrich and complicate the professional game. The ripple effect also reached fans and communities. Alumni, local supporters, and state residents followed these players into the professional ranks with the same emotional investment they had displayed in college. Every tackle, interception, or touchdown was evaluated against the backdrop of college memories. The rivalry had become nationalized, transmitted through media coverage, broadcast commentary, and fan networks. The emotional continuity between college and professional play transformed individual games into broader cultural events that resonated across generations. Ultimately, the case of the Gators and the Seminoles illustrates the enduring power of college rivalries in shaping professional football. The NFL inherited these conflicts, and the intensity that fueled them continued to inform performance, relationships, and culture. Players carried not only skills, but identities forged in college. And those identities influenced behavior on and off the field. Rivalries became living threads, connecting Saturday to Sunday, campus to professional stadiums, and local allegiances to national audiences. The lessons of this case study extend beyond Florida. They reveal a pattern repeated across the league. Rivalries from universities in Ohio, Michigan, Alabama, and Texas followed players into professional play, shaping strategies, interactions, and fan engagement. The NFL did not exist in a vacuum. It evolved from the culture, emotion, and history of college football. And the Florida State rivalry serves as a vivid example of how these inherited dynamics could manifest, sometimes explosively, within the professional arena. In reflecting on the trajectory of these players and teams, it is clear that college rivalries were not merely antecedents to professional competition. They were formative forces that influenced decision-making, emotional resilience, and interpersonal dynamics. The Gators and Seminoles rivalry demonstrates that professional football is as much about navigating human relationships and cultural legacies as it is about physical skill and strategic execution. Saturday does not end at graduation. It follows players into professional life, shaping the league in subtle and enduring ways. The Florida State case underscores a central truth of the NFL. It is a league built upon the cumulative intensity of decades of college football rivalries. Emotional loyalty, personal vendetta, and regional pride are carried into the professional sphere, influencing the way games are played. teams are constructed, and fans engage with the sport. The story of the Gators and Seminoles in the NFL reveals that professional football is inseparable from its collegiate roots and that the legacies of rivalry endure in every huddle, every snap, and every contested play. The Southeastern Conference during the 1970s through the 1990s was more than a collection of college football programs. It was a cultural institution, a crucible of identity, pride, and fierce competition that extended far beyond the field. The intensity of SEC rivalries forged players in an environment where loyalty was paramount, and every victory carried symbolic weight for the state, the school, and the fans. When players from this region entered the NFL, they brought with them not only exceptional skill, but a psychological framework shaped by decades of competition and expectation. The Southern Kingdom of college football left an indelible imprint on the professional game, influencing, recruiting, loyalty, and locker room culture in ways that continue to resonate. During this era, SEC programs dominated the national landscape. Alabama, under coaches like Bear Bryant, epitomized disciplined, rigorous preparation. The University of Florida, Auburn, Georgia, and LSU cultivated players who were both physically dominant and psychologically conditioned to embrace the intense pressure of rivalry football. These programs emphasized identity as much as athletic skill. Success was defined not only by wins and losses, but by adherence to a cultural standard that demanded loyalty, respect for hierarchy, and the ability to withstand scrutiny from a passionate fan base. Players learned early that individual achievement was inseparable from collective pride, and that mistakes could carry social consequences as significant as athletic ones. When NFL teams began recruiting heavily from the SEC, they inherited more than talent. They absorbed the psychological and cultural imprint of the region. Executives valued these players not only for their physical abilities, but for their ingrained work ethic, toughness, and capacity to thrive under pressure. Yet integrating this cohort into professional locker rooms required careful navigation. The intensity of SEC loyalty could translate into friction when players from Northern or Western programs were introduced. Differences in culture, preparation, and approach to authorities sometimes created tension, particularly in teams with a geographically diverse roster. The Southern Kingdom arrived in the NFL with both immense potential and complex social dynamics. Players themselves carried the pride of their programs into professional life. Interviews with former NFL athletes who played during this period consistently emphasize the importance of identity. For many, wearing a professional uniform did not erase the allegiance to the state and school that had shaped them. They approached every practice, meeting, and game through the lens of their SEC upbringing, measuring teammates, opponents, and even coaches against the standards instilled in them during their college careers. This often created an invisible hierarchy within teams, as players from certain schools assumed informal authority or influence based on the reputations of their alma maters. Recruiting practices reflected this cultural influence. Scouts frequently prioritized SEC talent not merely for physical attributes, but for the perceived mental toughness and competitive edge fostered in the region. Analysts at the time noted that SEC players brought a combination of athleticism and psychological resilience that was difficult to replicate elsewhere. Professional teams leveraged this perception, sometimes favoring SEC athletes in drafts or trades to instill a sense of toughness and commitment within the roster. The legacy of Southern football was thus embedded in the structural decisions of NFL management, demonstrating that college culture could shape professional strategy as much as performance metrics. The effect of SEC culture on locker rooms was profound. Players who had been conditioned to operate in high-pressure, rivalry-driven environments brought a heightened sense of intensity and expectation. Their presence could elevate standards for training, discipline, and preparation. But it could also create tension with teammates from other regions who had been socialized differently. Leadership dynamics often reflected these differences, with SEC alumni assuming roles as informal enforcers of professional standards. These players were accustomed to commanding respect and navigating hierarchical structures, and their influence often extended beyond the field into the social organization of the team. One vivid example involves a team in the late 1980s that integrated multiple SEC stars into a roster previously dominated by players from Midwestern programs. Early in training camp, conflicts arose over preparation methods and expectations for discipline. SEC players demanded rigorous adherence to drills and conditioning routines, while some Northern teammates preferred a more flexible approach. Tensions peaked in practice sessions where mistakes were met with pointed criticism, reflecting the Southern cultural emphasis on accountability and perfection. Over time, however, these dynamics contributed to the team's development, establishing a standard that ultimately improved performance while also reshaping the professional culture of the roster. SEC pride also influenced fan perception and loyalty in the NFL. Teams with multiple SEC alumni often attracted attention from Southern media outlets and fan bases, who followed the careers of former college stars with particular intensity. These players became symbolic extensions of regional identity, carrying the hopes and expectations of fans who had invested emotionally in Saturday contests for years. Professional performance was therefore evaluated through a dual lens, as part of the team and as a representative of the cultural and athletic legacy of the Southern Kingdom. The pressure on players was substantial, reinforcing the link between regional identity and professional expectation. The influence of the SEC extended into broader strategic decisions in the league. Coaches recognized that integrating players with strong collegiate identities could enhance motivation, instill discipline, and provide psychological resilience during high-stakes games. Draft boards often reflected this emphasis, with executives valuing the intangible qualities of loyalty, toughness, and competitive drive as highly as measurable athletic performance. The league itself, in absorbing the culture of the SEC, became more complex, with emotional, cultural, and historical factors influencing decisions in ways that were not easily quantified. The impact of SEC pride on professional football demonstrates the enduring nature of college culture. Loyalty, identity, and competition were not shed at graduation. They were transmitted into the professional sphere, influencing behavior, strategy, and performance. The Southern Kingdom created a cohort of athletes whose influence extended far beyond the field, shaping locker room culture, team dynamics, and league-wide perceptions of toughness and resilience. These legacies persist in professional football, informing both player development and organizational strategy decades later. The SEC also exemplified the broader principle that college football serves as a formative psychological environment. Players are trained not only physically, but emotionally and socially. They carried these lessons into professional life, affecting interactions, performance, and leadership within teams. The cultural imprint of the SEC illustrates that professional football cannot be fully understood without recognizing the depth of college influence, particularly in regions where identity, loyalty, and competition are deeply intertwined. In conclusion, the Southern Kingdom shaped professional football in profound ways. Its players brought a combination of athletic talent, psychological resilience, and cultural identity into the NFL, influencing recruiting, locker room dynamics, and fan engagement. SEC pride acted as both a catalyst and a challenge, providing professional teams with a source of excellence while requiring careful management of inherited loyalties and expectations. The influence of the Southeastern Conference during the 1970s through the 1990s demonstrates that professional football is inseparable from the collegiate culture that preceded it, and that regional identity continues to inform the sport's psychological and cultural landscape. The Southeastern Conference during the 1970s through the 1990s was not merely a collection of college football programs. It was a crucible of identity, pride, and fierce competition that shaped players, fans, and the culture of American football itself. The intensity of SEC rivalries forged athletes in a climate where loyalty, regional pride, and personal reputation were as important as physical skill. Players emerged from these programs steeped in a psychological framework that emphasized competition, hierarchy, and relentless pursuit of excellence. When these athletes entered the NFL, they brought with them more than talent. They carried the traditions, expectations, and emotional imprints of a region where football was both religion and identity. The Southern Kingdom of college football exerted an outsized influence on professional recruiting, locker room culture, and team cohesion, shaping the league in ways that still resonate today. During this era, SEC programs dominated national attention. Alabama, under Bear Bryant, exemplified a program that demanded discipline, toughness, and mental fortitude. Auburn, LSU, Florida, and Georgia produced athletes capable of thriving under immense pressure, with coaching staffs instilling values that extended beyond the gridiron. Success was measured not only in wins, but in adherence to a code of conduct, respect for hierarchy, and the ability to endure scrutiny from passionate fan bases. Players internalized these standards, understanding that a single mistake could have consequences both professionally and personally. The culture created in the CC emphasized accountability, resilience, and the development of character alongside athletic ability. NFL teams recognized the value of SEC talent for its combination of physical prowess and psychological preparedness. Scouts prioritized athletes from this region not only because of their performance on the field, but because of their capacity to operate under pressure, navigate conflict, and assume leadership roles. SEC players were perceived as psychologically hardened, capable of thriving in the most demanding professional environments. At the same time, integrating these athletes into diverse NFL rosters required careful management. Players from Northern or Western programs often had different cultural approaches, emphasizing analytical preparation or collaborative leadership over the hierarchical and emotionally intense model of the SEC. The resulting interactions shaped locker room dynamics in profound ways. Players from SEC programs carried pride and identity into professional life, often making it a defining aspect of their presence in the NFL. For many, wearing a professional uniform did not erase allegiance to their alma mater or state. They approached games and practices through the lens of their collegiate experience, measuring themselves and others against the standards that had defined success in their formative years. This sometimes created invisible hierarchies within professional rosters, with SEC alumni assuming informal authority, expecting deference, or asserting leadership based on the reputations of their programs. The influence of SEC culture was immediate and tangible, affecting team behavior on and off the field. Recruiting strategies in the NFL were shaped by the cultural weight of the SEC. Executives understood that players from these programs brought more than skill. They brought work ethic, competitive intensity, and resilience forged in environments where football was a central axis of life. Draft boards often reflected this preference, with teams seeking athletes who could not only perform, but also instill discipline and toughness within the locker room. Selecting an SEC player was a strategic decision that considered psychological and social impact as much as athletic metrics, a recognition that college culture could meaningfully shape professional performance. Locker room culture was directly influenced by SEC pride. Players accustomed to the intensity and hierarchical structure, other college programs maintained those patterns in professional settings. The presence of SEC athletes often raised standards for preparation, discipline, and accountability, challenging teammates from other regions to adapt. Conflicts occasionally arose when contrasting approaches to practice, leadership, or interpersonal communication collided. Coaches played a critical role in managing these dynamics, balancing the motivation and intensity brought by SEC players with the need for cohesion and collaboration among a geographically diverse roster. SEC athletes also carried an acute awareness of fan expectations. Regional supporters, alumni networks, and state media followed these players into the NFL with intense loyalty. A professional player was not only representing a city or team, but also embodying the pride of his college and region. This dual accountability intensified performance pressure. Mistakes could resonate beyond the team, affecting perceptions within a broader cultural and emotional context. The relationship between fan engagement and SEC identity contributed to the psychological landscape of professional football, influencing how players approached preparation, performance, and interpersonal dynamics. the influence of SEC culture extended to professional strategy. Coaches and management recognized that athletes from this region brought a distinct competitive edge, shaped by exposure to high-stakes rivalry games and intense coaching regimes. The expectation of rigor, the capacity for emotional resilience, and the experience of navigating deeply rooted rivalries made SEC alumni desirable not only for individual performance, but also for their ability to elevate team culture. Their presence could shape norms, expectations, and conduct within the locker room, creating standards that influenced team cohesion, accountability, and professional identity. SEC influence was particularly evident in cases where multiple alumni populated a single roster. In these instances, players often formed subgroups, bringing shared experiences and cultural norms into the professional environment. These subgroups could serve as stabilizing forces, reinforcing professional expectations and mentoring younger teammates. At the same time, they could exacerbate tension when their cultural approach contrasted sharply with those of players from different regions or programs. Navigating these dynamics required emotional intelligence from both players and coaches, with success dependent on the ability to integrate diverse backgrounds while leveraging the strengths brought by SEC conditioning and culture. The Southern Kingdom also played a significant role in shaping NFL identity more broadly. The league, already a reflection of regional and national dynamics, absorbed the emotional and cultural imprint of SEC football. Teams that drafted heavily from this conference often carried the values of toughness, loyalty, and intensity into their organizational ethos. Fans, executives, and media alike recognize the significance of these players beyond their individual performance. The SEC created a template for professionalism, resilience, and competitive fervor that influenced how the NFL was played, managed, and consumed. The legacy of SEC pride during the 1970s through the 1990s is enduring. It demonstrates that professional football is inseparable from the college culture that shaped its athletes. Players carry not only skill but identity, expectations, and regional allegiance into their professional careers. Locker room dynamics, recruitment strategies, and fan engagement are all influenced by this cultural inheritance. The Southern Kingdom, with its intense rivalries, high-pressure environment, and deeply ingrained sense of pride, became a defining force in the evolution of the NFL ultimately. The SEC exemplifies how college culture continues to mold professional football. Players emerge from these programs carrying lessons in discipline, loyalty, and resilience, applying them within the complexities of professional rosters. The league benefits from the competitive edge, toughness, and emotional intelligence of these athletes, while also negotiating the challenges of integrating diverse backgrounds and cultural approaches. The influence of SEC pride is a testament to the enduring impact of regional identity on the human and cultural dimensions of professional football. The Southern Kingdom created a generation of NFL players whose influence extended beyond athletic performance. Their presence shaped locker room norms, strategic thinking, and the psychological landscape of professional teams. The pride, identity, and intensity instilled by SEC programs were woven into the fabric of the league, influencing recruitment, leadership, and culture in ways that remain relevant today. Professional football is inseparable from the legacies of college competition, and the SEC stands as a prime example of how regional allegiance and institutional pride continue to inform the league's evolution. The Midwest has long been a region defined by industry, work ethic, and a sense of communal identity forged in the factories and workshops of cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, and Indianapolis. That identity translated seamlessly into the culture of college football, where programs such as Michigan, Ohio State, and Notre Dame cultivated players who embodied the values of hard work, resilience, and perseverance. The Midwest's industrial pride became the backbone of a football ethos that prized toughness, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to team over self. As players from these programs transitioned into the NFL, they carried with them not only physical skill, but the cultural imprint. of a region where labor and loyalty were inseparable from personal and professional identity. This bloodline from the Rust Belt shaped locker rooms, recruitment, and professional performance in profound ways, creating an enduring influence on the NFL that parallels the intensity of Southern allegiance. Michigan, Ohio State, and Notre Dame were more than athletic institutions. They were pillars of regional identity, symbols of pride for cities and states that had invested deeply in the culture of football. Games between these programs were not simply contests of athletic skill. They were symbolic battles representing the values, hopes, and rivalries of entire communities. Players were acutely aware that their performance carried consequences beyond the scoreboard. Wins and losses resonated throughout local media, among family networks, and within the broader fan community. This level of accountability cultivated a generation of athletes who approached the game with a seriousness and commitment that extended well beyond the collegiate field. The Midwest's football programs emphasized preparation, discipline, and adaptability. Coaches like Bo Schembechler at Michigan and Woody Hayes at Ohio State instilled rigorous training regimens and strategic precision, reflecting the values of the industrial communities that had given rise to them. Players were expected to show not only physical prowess, but mental resilience. They learned to thrive under pressure, to execute complex plays with precision, and to prioritize the success of the team over individual glory. Notre Dame, with its national profile, combined this ethos with a sense of broader ambition, producing athletes who were disciplined, adaptable, and prepared to perform on the largest stages. When these athletes entered the NFL, they brought a distinct cultural identity with them. Their approach to practice, preparation, and competition reflected the Rust Belt mindset: persistence, accountability, and an unyielding commitment to excellence. Coaches and executives recognized these qualities as valuable assets. Midwestern players were often seen as stabilizing forces within locker rooms, setting standards for professionalism and work ethic. Their presence influenced the behavior of teammates from other regions, establishing a culture in which effort, discipline, and reliability were as critical as raw talent. This cultural continuity reinforced the influence of college programs on professional performance. Recruiting strategies in the NFL frequently emphasized these attributes. Scouts and executives understood that a player from Michigan or Ohio State brought more than measurable skill. He brought the experience of thriving under intense scrutiny, a capacity for disciplined preparation, and a familiarity with high-stakes competition. These qualities made Midwestern athletes highly desirable for teams seeking stability and leadership within their rosters. Draft decisions were informed by assessments not only of athletic potential, but of psychological resilience and cultural fit, reflecting the enduring influence of the Rust Belt bloodline on professional football. Locker room dynamics were significantly affected by the presence of Midwestern alumni. Players who had been conditioned in programs emphasizing hierarchy, discipline, and accountability often assumed leadership roles within the team. Their approach to training, punctuality, and preparation established norms that influenced the behavior of peers. Conflicts occasionally arose when cultural approaches differed, particularly with players from regions accustomed to a more expressive or flexible approach to competition. Negotiating these differences required skillful leadership and mutual adaptation. Over time, however, the integration of Midwestern players strengthened team cohesion and reinforced a culture of professionalism and commitment. The influence of Midwestern pride extended to game preparation and performance. Athletes from this region were accustomed to intense rivalry games, strategic planning, and disciplined execution. Their mental toughness allowed them to remain focused in high-pressure situations, from critical fourth-quarter plays to playoff contests. Coaches relied on these players to set the tone for intensity and reliability, using their example to elevate the performance of the entire roster. The Rust Belt ethos of endurance and work ethic translated seamlessly into the NFL, shaping professional culture and influencing competitive outcomes. Midwestern alumni also carried the expectations of fans and communities with them. Cities and states that had supported their development for years remained invested in their professional careers. This ongoing accountability reinforced a sense of duty and pride. Success in the NFL was measured not only by individual achievement, but by the fulfillment of collective expectations established during college. Mistakes were scrutinized, victories celebrated, and loyalty to the team was often balanced with loyalty to the regional identity from which the player had emerged. The emotional and psychological dimensions of these relationships illustrate the depth of the influence that the Rust Belt had on professional football. Media narratives further reinforced the impact of Midwestern identity on the NFL. Sports journalists and commentators frequently emphasized the backgrounds of players, framing their professional performance as an extension of college rivalries and regional pride. Broadcasts and written accounts highlighted the work ethic, discipline, and competitive intensity cultivated in programs such as Michigan, Ohio State, and Notre Dame. Fans across the country absorbed these narratives, deepening their understanding of how college culture shaped professional competition and reinforcing the continuity between Saturday and Sunday football. The Rust Belt's influence also shaped inter-team dynamics. Professional teams that featured multiple Midwestern alumni often benefited from a shared cultural understanding. Players aligned in their approach to preparation, accountability, and competition, creating cohesion that could influence outcomes during high-pressure games. Conversely, teams lacking this cultural influence sometimes struggled with integration, particularly when players from diverse regions and collegiate traditions had to navigate conflicting expectations. The presence of Midwestern players created an internal standard that guided behavior, elevated performance, and established a sense of shared purpose within the roster. Ultimately, the Rust Belt bloodline demonstrates that professional football is deeply rooted in regional and cultural identities. College programs served as crucibles for personal development, shaping psychological resilience, leadership ability, and competitive drive. When these athletes entered the NFL, they carried with them more than skill. They brought the ethos of their communities, the pride of their programs, and the behavioral norms that had defined their formative years. The influence of the Midwest is evident in locker room culture, recruitment strategies, game preparation, and team cohesion. The legacy of the Rust Belt in professional football illustrates that the NFL cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the cultural foundations laid by college programs. Athletes from Michigan, Ohio State, and Notre Dame did not simply arrive in the league as players. They arrived as embodiments of regional identity and competitive philosophy. Their approach to the game, interactions with teammates, and performance under pressure were inseparable from the culture in which they were formed. This integration of regional values into professional football helped define the ethos of the NFL, reinforcing standards of toughness, loyalty, and perseverance that continue to shape the league. In reflecting on the impact of the Rust Belt, it is clear that the Midwest's college football culture provided more than talent. It provided a framework for discipline, a model for leadership, and a psychological foundation that influenced the way teams were constructed, coached, and managed. The influence of the Rust Belt bloodline is an enduring testament to the ways in which regional identity and cultural values shape professional sport, demonstrating that the history of American football is inseparable from the communities and traditions that nurtured it. The NFL Draft has always been a high-stakes affair, where fortunes are made or broken in the span of a few hours. Teams meticulously evaluate players, analyzing physical metrics, game film, and personal interviews. But beneath the surface of measurable data and scouting reports lies a more subtle influence, one that is rarely acknowledged, yet profoundly impactful. The alma maters of executives, scouts, and team decision-makers often colored their perceptions, guiding evaluations and shaping draft outcomes in ways that were part psychology, part personal allegiance, and part unspoken rivalry. In the formative decades of the NFL, this hidden bias introduced patterns of favoritism and prejudice into player selection, creating a professional landscape infused with the unresolved passions of college football. Executives have always been human, shaped by their experiences and allegiances. Many entered the league after playing or attending universities with deep-rooted rivalries, where team identity was intertwined with personal pride. When tasked with evaluating talent from schools they had cheered for or competed against, these executives carried subtle yet persistent biases. A scout who had grown up rooting for Ohio State might unconsciously favor players from that program, perceiving their character, intelligence, and toughness as superior. Conversely, players from rival institutions could be judged more harshly, their mistakes magnified, and their potential undervalued. In a draft room where decisions carry millions of dollars in potential salary and team success, these biases were rarely harmless. Historical accounts reveal multiple instances where alma mater influence affected draft decisions. In the 1960s and 1970s, it was common for GMs and scouts to be recruited from the colleges they had attended. They brought with them not only familiarity with the athletic programs, but also the cultural lens through which those programs were evaluated. Players who had faced them in college were often held to different standards than those from schools, outside their personal experience. In some cases, these preferences became part of team strategy. Executives actively sought to acquire athletes from programs they trusted, believing that familiarity with coaching styles, playbooks, and regional football philosophy would make the transition to professional football smoother. Bias in the draft room was not always explicit, but its impact was tangible. In some instances, executives rated players higher or lower based on personal affiliation, creating outcomes that were not purely meritocratic. A running back from a rival school might be overlooked despite superior performance metrics, while a quarterback from a favored program could be drafted early based on reputation and perceived reliability. These decisions often had long-term consequences for both the athletes and the franchises. A team that ignored talent due to bias risked missing a transformative player, while the favored athlete carried additional pressure to justify selection rooted in allegiance rather than performance. Several high-profile examples illustrate the phenomenon. One NFL team in the 1970s consistently prioritized athletes from a single conference, with executives who had spent their collegiate careers in that region. Analysts and journalists at the time noted that certain players with exceptional statistics from rival programs were repeatedly undervalued. Interviews with former scouts later confirmed that loyalty to their alma mater shaped evaluations, sometimes quietly, sometimes in discussions that influenced the overall draft strategy. While not inherently malicious, these biases created a subtle form of favoritism that shaped rosters and influenced the competitive balance within the league. Alma mater influence also extended to the negotiation process after the draft. Executives who trusted the cultural background and coaching philosophy of certain colleges were often more willing to invest resources, provide extended opportunities in training camp, and advocate for those athletes internally. Conversely, players from rival programs could be given shorter leashes, face more stringent evaluations, or encounter skepticism from multiple levels of management. This disparity in opportunity was rooted not in talent, but in perceived cultural compatibility, demonstrating how personal history could affect professional trajectories. The psychological impact on players was significant. Athletes recognized that their performance was judged not only on merit, but also through the lens of professional allegiances shaped by past rivalries. Interviews with former NFL players reveal frustration and awareness of these dynamics. Some recalled being questioned more aggressively in interviews, scrutinized during drills, or evaluated with a harsher lens because of their college affiliation. Others found themselves celebrated and supported disproportionately, their opportunities enhanced by the subjective influence of executives' loyalty. This invisible variable in player development and team construction introduced an additional layer of challenge in an already competitive environment. Media coverage played a role in amplifying the impact of alma mater bias. Journalists covering the draft often highlighted connections between players and team executives, framing selection decisions as extensions of historical rivalries or personal allegiances. Headlines occasionally underscored patterns of favoritism, noting when a team repeatedly drafted from a single college or avoided players from a rival program. Fans, in turn, internalized these narratives, perceiving the draft as not only a strategic process but also a battleground of cultural and regional loyalty. The professional implications of these biases were thus reinforced and magnified by public perception. Executives were aware, to varying degrees, of the ethical and strategic consequences of their biases. Some attempted to counteract them by standardizing evaluation metrics, consulting external analysts, or delegating decision-making to reduce subjectivity. Others embraced the cultural continuity, believing that players from familiar programs were inherently more reliable and aligned with the team's values. This duality reflects the tension between objective assessment and subjective influence that has characterized the draft for decades. It also highlights the enduring power of personal experience, regional identity, and collegiate rivalry in shaping professional football. Scandals and controversies occasionally emerged when biases were perceived to be egregious. Allegations of favoritism, nepotism, and partiality surfaced in trade negotiations, draft board leaks, and internal team memos. While rarely resulting in formal sanctions, these cases exposed the human dimension of the draft process, revealing that decisions were never purely objective or free from emotional influence. The bloodline of collegiate rivalry, once confined to Saturday games, had infiltrated the professional executive level, shaping not only player careers, but the strategic landscape of the league itself. The implications of alma mater bias extend beyond individual cases. The culture of favoritism based on collegiate affiliation reinforced broader patterns of regional influence within the NFL. Teams became associated with specific college pipelines, creating an informal network in which identity, loyalty, and personal history shaped both recruitment and team culture. This systemic influence underscores the continuity between college football and the professional league, illustrating that the unresolved passions, rivalries, and cultural allegiances cultivated in collegiate programs have long-lasting effects on organizational behavior and competitive dynamics. In examining the NFL draft through this lens, it becomes clear that professional football is as much a reflection of human history, experience, and allegiance as it is a measure of athletic skill. Alma mater influence, whether overt or subtle, reveals the inseparability of personal narrative and professional evaluation. The biases, loyalties, and historical connections that executives carry into the draft room demonstrate that the NFL is a continuation of a cultural and emotional ecosystem formed in college. Draft outcomes, team composition, and player development are all influenced by this intangible yet powerful legacy. The blood in the draft room is not literal, but symbolic. It represents the enduring power of past rivalries, regional pride, and personal allegiance that infiltrates the highest levels of professional decision-making. The stories of overlooked athletes, overvalued stars, and internal controversies reveal a league deeply influenced by the human dimensions of history and identity. Understanding these dynamics is essential to comprehending the culture, evolution, and sometimes chaotic outcomes of the NFL draft. In conclusion, the intersection of personal allegiance, collegiate rivalry, and professional evaluation created a complex ecosystem in the NFL draft. Executives were human interpreters of talent, influenced by the history of their own experiences and the rivalries that had shaped them. Players were subject to these invisible forces, navigating a landscape in which merit and identity were intertwined. The consequences of alma mater influence shaped rosters, careers, and competitive balance, leaving a lasting imprint on the league that extended far beyond the individual draft years. The draft room became a theater of history, memory, and rivalry, where the past continued to shape the future of professional football. The relationship between professional football and the media has always been complicated. Sports journalists do more than report scores or provide analysis. They shape narratives, amplify rivalries, and influence the cultural perception of athletes and teams. In the early decades of the NFL, the presence of journalists with allegiances to rival colleges added a layer of complexity to professional football. Reporters who had covered Michigan, Ohio State, Alabama, or Notre Dame carried with them the stories, biases, and emotional intensity of their collegiate affiliations. These loyalties were not merely personal preferences, they influenced coverage, commentary, and the framing of narratives, creating a media environment where rivalry extended beyond the field into the pages of newspapers, the airwaves of radio, and eventually the broadcasts of national television. In the post-war era, newspapers were the primary conduit of information for fans. Sports sections were read voraciously, and the opinions of columnists carried substantial weight. A journalist who had covered a college rivalry for years developed expertise, credibility, and influence. And these traits did not disappear when the players he had watched entered the professional ranks. Coverage often framed players and teams through the lens of prior allegiances. A player from a rival college might be depicted as overconfident, volatile, or untested, while an alumnus of a favored program could be lauded for work ethic, intelligence, and leadership potential. These subtle biases shaped public perception and contributed to the emotional intensity of professional rivalries. Radio broadcasts further amplified the influence of collegiate allegiances. Sportscasters, many of whom had grown up attending college games or reporting on college football, brought their perspectives to professional contests. Their commentary could highlight a player's previous college achievements or failures, framing professional performance within the narrative of unresolved rivalries. Listeners internalized these interpretations, often forming opinions before witnessing a single NFL game firsthand. The media, intentionally or unintentionally, became a mechanism through which college loyalty continued to influence professional football culture. Television expanded the reach and impact of these narratives. By the 1960s and 1970s, televised NFL games reached national audiences, and commentators became the primary interpreters of player performance and team dynamics. Many commentators had covered college football, and their commentary often reflected their allegiances. The framing of players from rival schools shaped fan perception, sometimes creating emotional polarization within communities and even within team fan bases. When a journalist emphasized a past rivalry, a controversial play, or an off-field incident, it was understood as a continuation of a larger story that began in college. Television solidified these narratives, giving them both credibility and emotional weight. Media influence affected the athletes themselves. Players were acutely aware that journalists carried histories of college rivalry into the professional world. A quarterback from Alabama entering the NFL knew that columnists with affiliations to rival schools might scrutinize him more intensely or frame mistakes more harshly. A lineman from Ohio State understood that regional loyalty among reporters could affect the coverage of his career trajectory. This awareness introduced an additional psychological dimension to professional football, where performance was constantly filtered through the lens of historical allegiances. Athletes were not only competing against opponents on the field, but against the narratives constructed by journalists with personal and cultural stakes in the outcome. Sports journalists also played a role in shaping team reputation. Teams with rosters heavily populated by alumni from certain colleges were often framed as embodying the values, strengths, or weaknesses of those programs. Conversely, teams with a mix of players from rival schools could be depicted as fractured or conflicted. Reports of locker room tension, disputes over leadership, or personality clashes were amplified when journalists applied their understanding of college rivalries to interpret professional dynamics. This media framing influenced how fans, executives, and even other players perceived team culture, contributing to a feedback loop that reinforced college identities within professional environments. National coverage intensified during playoff seasons. Journalists drew on the emotional resonance of college rivalries to heighten drama, emphasizing historical connections between players and teams. Headlines and commentary often evoked decades-old college conflicts, portraying NFL matchups as extensions of unresolved competitions from Saturday afternoons. The emotional polarization of fans increased, as allegiances formed not solely around professional franchises, but around college identities embedded within team rosters. The media's role was central to this phenomenon, transforming professional football into a narrative arena where historical loyalty and contemporary performance collided. Some journalists recognized the ethical responsibility inherent in their influence and attempted to maintain objectivity. Others, however, embraced the dramatic potential of rivalry-driven storytelling, understanding that emotionally charged narratives increased readership, listenership, and viewership. The business incentive to amplify conflict and polarization often intersected with personal biases, resulting in coverage that was as much about sustaining engagement as it was about reporting facts. Players and coaches had to navigate this landscape carefully, balancing professional obligations with the awareness that their actions and words were continuously interpreted through a prism of historical rivalry and media expectation. The impact of media-driven tribalism was particularly visible in player comparisons. Analysts frequently ranked athletes not only on skill and performance, but on perceived character, mental toughness, and loyalty to their college alma mater. Rankings were influenced by the cumulative weight of prior narratives, creating perceptions that could persist for years. A player who had excelled at Michigan but entered a team dominated by SEC alumni might be scrutinized more heavily. His achievements contextualized in terms of regional or institutional rivalry. Conversely, a player from a favorite program could receive undue benefit of the doubt, receiving praise for marginal performances or leniency in evaluation. Journalists also influenced the perception of coaching decisions. Draft picks, trades, and position assignments were often framed as strategic maneuvers shaped by regional allegiance. Coaches were scrutinized for favoring players from specific colleges, and media commentary reinforced the notion that professional decisions were extensions of personal history and college rivalry. This analysis became part of the ongoing storylines that fans consumed, embedding college allegiances into professional narratives and reinforcing the emotional significance of games. Ultimately, the media wars illustrate that professional football is inseparable from the narratives constructed around it. Journalists who carried the memory and emotion of college rivalries into the NFL amplified divisions, shaped perception, and influenced fan engagement. They created a lens through which professional play was interpreted, intensifying emotional investment and reinforcing identity-based loyalty. The coverage of teams and players was never neutral. It was a continuation of cultural, regional, and institutional histories that had defined American football long before the NFL emerged as a national spectacle. Through the influence of journalists, unresolved college rivalries became professional dramas. Fans internalized these narratives, shaping expectations and emotional investment. Players carried the weight of these interpretations into locker rooms and onto the field. Executives understood that public perception, amplified by the media, could affect team culture and strategic decisions. Professional football became both a sport and a story, with narratives rooted in the history, allegiances, and emotional intensity of college football. In examining the role of media, it is clear that journalists acted as both observers and participants in the perpetuation of rivalry. Their reporting reinforced cultural identity, shaped psychological pressure, and influenced the perception of players and teams. Media-driven tribalism became a defining element of professional football culture, ensuring that college rivalries continued to exert influence long after players left campus. These dynamic underscores the complex relationship between sports, identity, and storytelling, revealing that professional football is as much about cultural continuity as it is about athletic competition. In conclusion, the media wars demonstrate that the stories surrounding professional football are inseparable from the emotional and cultural heritage of college football. Journalists with ties to rival programs amplified narratives, heightened fan polarization, and influenced both perception and performance. The result is a league in which professional decisions, player development, and fan engagement are intertwined with the legacy of Saturday football. The media's role in perpetuating rivalries has left an indelible mark on the NFL, one that continues to shape how the game is experienced, interpreted, and remembered. The rise of the internet and social media has transformed the way professional football is experienced. And with it, the enduring influence of college rivalries has only intensified. Platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram have created spaces where fans, analysts, and players can interact in real time, magnifying emotions and allowing historical allegiances to play out on a global scale. College loyalties, once primarily confined to stadiums and local communities, now intersect with professional fandom in ways that are immediate, persistent, and highly visible. The grudges, biases, and passions rooted in decades of collegiate competition continue to shape narratives, influence fan behavior, and even affect the reputations of current NFL players. In the modern era, fan engagement is relentless. Every game, trade, and social media post is subject to scrutiny. And the lens through which fans interpret these events is heavily informed by historical rivalries. A player who starred at a traditional powerhouse college carries the weight of that legacy into the NFL. Fans of rival programs are quick to judge performance, criticize decisions, or celebrate mistakes. This dynamic has created a digital extension of the college rivalry ecosystem, one where Saturday grudges are carried onto Sunday and into online forums and comment sections, where debate can be endless and emotion often dominates logic. Social media amplifies these dynamics in ways that previous generations could not have imagined. A touchdown, a fumble, or a penalty is instantly dissected by thousands, sometimes millions, of voices online. College affiliations are frequently invoked in these discussions, with users drawing comparisons, recalling past matchups, or highlighting perceived behavioral tendencies associated with the player's alma mater. Historical biases are recycled and magnified, reinforcing the cultural continuity of rivalry and creating an environment in which professional performance is inseparable from collegiate identity. Players themselves are not immune to the influence of modern fan culture. Social media can be a source of pressure, with athletes aware that their college history will be invoked in praise or criticism. Offensive posts, viral clips, and online commentary often reference the player's previous college experience, drawing attention to patterns of behavior or leadership style developed during formative years. Interviews and public statements are sometimes framed through the lens of alumni bias, creating an ongoing narrative in which professional conduct and past collegiate affiliations are intertwined. This constant connectivity magnifies psychological pressure and complicates the management of public persona and professional performance. The media has adapted alongside social platforms to meet demand for content that bridges college history and professional football. Analysts frequently reference college careers, rivalries, and fan allegiances in their commentary. Highlight reels often juxtapose NFL performance with collegiate highlights, reinforcing the narrative that past identities continue to define present outcomes. Networks capitalize on the emotional resonance of these connections, understanding that viewers are drawn to stories that situate current players within the context of historical conflict. Ratings, engagement, and sponsorship opportunities are directly linked to the perpetuation of these narratives, creating commercial incentives to highlight rivalry-driven storylines. Fan identity in the modern era is deeply intertwined with social media expression. Users align themselves with not only professional teams, but also with the collegiate legacies embedded within team rosters. Memes, hashtags, and discussion threads frequently reference historical rivalries, and the resulting discourse is both performative and participatory. Fans derive satisfaction from invoking historical college conflicts, celebrating victories, or mocking mistakes in a way that reinforces their own cultural and emotional affiliation. The continuation of these rivalries online ensures that college loyalties remain a central aspect of NFL fandom, regardless of the professional setting. The influence of historical allegiances is evident in the intensity of online debates surrounding player acquisitions and trades. When a team signs a player from a rival program, social media often erupts with discussion of potential locker room friction, strategic alignment, or historical context. Analysts, former players, and fans weigh in, offering interpretations informed by decades of rivalry. Draft picks are scrutinized not only for athletic potential, but also for the compatibility of college culture with professional rosters. These discussions highlight the ongoing relevance of regional and institutional identity in shaping perceptions of professional football, illustrating that the legacies of college rivalries are far from dormant. Professional teams have recognized the implications of this digital culture. Social media engagement has become a factor in public relations, marketing strategies, and even fan management. Organizations monitor online discourse, responding to narratives and anticipating the impact of historical rivalries on contemporary perception. Player support systems increasingly include guidance on navigating social media, addressing fan criticism, and managing personal branding. In this way, the modern NFL operates not only as an athletic competition, but also as a cultural and emotional theater, where college allegiances continue to influence both the perception and reception of professional performance. The psychological impact on players extends to the locker room and personal interactions. Athletes understand that online discourse can create expectations and judgments based on collegiate affiliation. This awareness can influence behavior, leadership dynamics, and interpersonal relationships within teams. The digital perpetuation of rivalry adds a persistent layer of emotional complexity, where the history of Saturday football continues to shape conduct, cohesion, and morale on Sundays. The weight of public perception, magnified by technology, ensures that the legacy of college rivalries remains embedded in professional experience. Fan engagement has evolved into a global phenomenon. College rivalries that once played out primarily in regional stadiums now have audiences across the country and around the world. International fans, social media communities, and online forums participate in debates, share historical anecdotes, and amplify the emotional resonance of past conflicts. The professional game has become a stage where the unresolved passions of collegiate competition are performed for an audience that spans generations and geography. The persistence of these rivalries highlights the enduring power of cultural memory and identity within the framework of professional football. Social media has also reshaped the narratives surrounding controversial incidents. Player altercations, disputes with coaches, or performance failures are frequently interpreted through the lens of college allegiances. Tweets, viral clips, and forum discussions reference prior rivalries, framing professional events as extensions of historical conflict. This environment ensures that unresolved college grudges remain highly relevant, affecting perception and shaping discourse around team culture, player character, and league narratives. Professional football is therefore experienced not as a neutral sport, but as a continuation of the cultural and emotional ecosystem cultivated by college rivalries. The modern era demonstrates that rivalry is no longer confined to the field. Social media creates a persistent, participatory, and public arena where college allegiances influence fan discourse, media narratives, and player experience. The legacy of historical rivalries remains central to professional football, shaping perceptions, interactions, and emotional investment. Athletes, coaches, and executives operate within a cultural context that is continuously reinforced and amplified by digital platforms, ensuring that the past continues to define the present. The continuation of old grudges in the social media age illustrates the complex, enduring relationship between college and professional football. Loyalty, identity, and rivalry, once expressed primarily through regional and institutional channels, now manifest in instantaneous, global, and interactive ways. The emotional resonance of historical allegiances continues to influence perception, performance, and engagement, demonstrating that the influence of college rivalries on professional football is as potent today as it was decades ago. In conclusion, the modern era has transformed the ways in which college loyalties shape the NFL. Social media has amplified, extended, and globalized the influence of historical rivalries, ensuring that Saturday allegiances continue to impact Sunday games. Fans, players, executives, and media participants operate within a network of cultural memory and emotional investment that spans decades, illustrating that the legacies of college football are never dormant. The continuation of these rivalries in the professional era reinforces the enduring power of identity, loyalty, and cultural history in shaping the experience and perception of the NFL. In professional football, the rivalry often extends far beyond the players on the field. Coaches who carry the legacies of their college days into the NFL have been instrumental in perpetuating a culture of tension, pride, and competition that traces back decades. These men, often having faced each other on Saturday afternoons in the most intense college matchups, bring unresolved feelings, strategies, and philosophies into the professional realm. Their history with one another shapes game planning, media narratives, and sometimes even locker room dynamics. In the NFL, these personal histories are rarely publicized in full, yet they have profoundly influenced matchups, rivalries, and the emotional tenor of the sport. The concept of coaches' Cold Wars begins with the psychological and emotional residue of college football. Coaches form identities around their victories and losses, their triumphs and humiliations on the collegiate gridiron. When they transition to the NFL, these identities are not left behind. Instead, they shape decision-making, attitudes toward opponents, and management styles. For example, a coach who endured repeated defeats at the hands of a rival in college often carries a blend of grudging respect, personal determination, and competitive obsession into professional games. Every play call, defensive adjustment, and personnel decision can be subtly influenced by the memory of past encounters. One early instance of this phenomenon occurred in the late 1960s, when two coaches who had faced each other in college, one representing a northern industrial university and the other from a southern powerhouse, found themselves leading NFL teams. Media coverage at the time hinted at a personal narrative layered over professional competition, with reporters speculating on whether the history of college games would impact strategic decisions. Interviews with players and assistants later revealed that these coaches indeed referenced past experiences in private meetings, framing game preparation in terms of historical rivalry rather than purely tactical considerations. The tension was palpable, and the outcome of the games was often viewed not only through the lens of team performance, but also as a personal contest of legacy and ego. The influence of these Cold Wars extends into player evaluation and team building. Coaches often favor athletes from programs they trust or with whom they share philosophical alignment. This extends from play style to character assessment, reflecting a belief that familiarity breeds reliability. Conversely, players affiliated with programs that were part of a coach's collegiate rivalries could be scrutinized more intensely. Interviews, practice performance, and off-field behavior were sometimes interpreted through the lens of historical suspicion. A quarterback who had faced a coach's college team might find himself under greater scrutiny, his mistakes magnified by past allegiances, while a player from the coach's alma mater could receive the benefit of the doubt in ambiguous situations. The Cold Wars also manifest in media strategy. Coaches aware of their personal histories with counterparts often leverage the press to shape narratives, highlighting past encounters or referencing college records to influence perception. These statements were rarely explicit about personal rivalry, yet the subtext was unmistakable to journalists and fans familiar with the history. Headlines and commentary amplified these tensions, framing professional games as extensions of decades-old competitions. Fans engaged with these narratives, relishing the idea that old grudges were playing out on the national stage, even when the players themselves were unaware of the full historical context. Some coaches were overt about these rivalries, using the memory of past contests to motivate their teams. Speeches in the locker room frequently invoked lessons learned from college battles, positioning professional matchups as opportunities to achieve personal vindication. In these cases, the line between professional strategy and personal ambition blurred. Success was measured not only by the scoreboard, but by a sense of historical justice. A psychological victory over a long-standing rival. This approach could inspire players, create cohesion, and heighten intensity. But it also introduced risk, as personal vendettas occasionally clouded judgment and strategic clarity. Cold wars between coaches have been particularly visible in playoff contexts. The high stakes of elimination games amplify the emotional charge, and the shadow of past collegiate encounters becomes more pronounced. Game planning, film study, and situational strategy are informed by decades of rivalry, creating a layer of narrative tension for both participants and observers. Players entering these matchups often report feeling the weight of history, understanding that their coach's personal motivations may influence in-game decisions, substitutions, and play calling. The NFL in these moments becomes a stage where legacy, pride, and unresolved history intersect with athletic execution. Assistant coaches and staff members also experience the impact of these rivalries. Decisions regarding rotations, practice intensity, and focus areas are influenced by the perspectives and memories of head coaches. Young coaches and coordinators learn from the example of their mentors, internalizing attitudes shaped by college experiences. The ripple effect ensures that the emotional and strategic influence of past rivalries extends beyond the head coach, permeating the culture of the organization. Teams become, in essence, extensions of college legacies, carrying personal histories into every aspect of preparation and performance. The phenomenon of coaches' Cold Wars is not confined to a single era or geographic region. Northern, Southern, and Midwestern programs all contributed to a culture in which personal history mattered as much as professional obligation. Conferences like the Big Ten, SEC, and Pac-12 produced a generation of coaches whose identities were deeply intertwined with their collegiate experience. When these men entered the NFL, the personal rivalries cultivated on campus were embedded into professional practice, creating long-lasting narratives that influenced game outcomes, team culture, and fan perception. Moreover, these Cold Wars highlight the human dimension of professional football. Beyond X's and O's, beyond statistics and scouting reports, the NFL is shaped by emotion, history, and memory. Coaches are not merely strategists. They are individuals with personal narratives that intersect with the broader history of the sport. Their rivalries, grudges, and loyalties demonstrate that professional football is a continuation of a larger cultural and emotional ecosystem. The stories of these rivalries add depth and complexity to our understanding of the league, revealing that personal history can have consequences as significant as talent and strategy. The modern landscape of coaching still reflects these dynamics. While the NFL has become more sophisticated in analytics, strategy, and player development, the legacy of personal history remains influential. Interviews with contemporary coaches reveal awareness of past rivalries, whether in public statements, media interactions, or game preparation. Social media has added visibility to these narratives, allowing fans to trace historical connections and understand the emotional subtext of matchups. The persistence of these Cold Wars underscores the enduring human element in a league often celebrated for its technical precision and professional execution. In summary, coaches' Cold Wars are a testament to the intertwining of personal history, professional ambition, and cultural legacy in the NFL. The rivalries cultivated on college campuses carry forward into professional competition, shaping strategic decisions, player evaluations, and team culture. These dynamics influence not only outcomes on the field, but also the narratives consumed by fans and amplified by media. Understanding the role of personal history in coaching provides insight into the complexity of professional football, revealing that beneath the surface of competition lies a network of human emotion, memory, and unresolved rivalry. The Cold Wars among coaches demonstrate that the influence of college football extends far beyond the student-athlete experience. The personal histories of men leading NFL teams shape decisions, strategies, and the emotional environment of professional football. Their rivalries, grudges, and loyalties become embedded in organizational culture, creating a continuity of conflict that spans decades. For players, executives, fans, and analysts, these narratives enrich the understanding of the game while reminding us that professional football is inseparable from the human stories that fuel it. Professional football is often measured in wins, losses, and championships. But beneath the surface lies a complex financial ecosystem influenced by history, identity, and loyalty. College allegiances extend far beyond the stadium and locker room, seeping into the financial structures that sustain professional franchises. From sponsorships to alumni donations, from merchandise sales to regional marketing, the legacy of college football plays an underappreciated role in shaping the economic realities of the NFL. Teams do not exist in isolation. They are embedded within networks of cultural and institutional loyalty that have material consequences for revenue, branding, and long-term viability. Understanding the business of loyalty provides insight into why rivalries endure, why certain draft and trade decisions carry weight beyond athletics, and how the financial architecture of the NFL is intertwined with the emotional histories of fans, alumni, and players. Sponsorship is one of the clearest arenas where college loyalties influence professional football. Companies recognize the value of associating with teams whose rosters contain players from historically prestigious colleges. Alumni networks and regional fan bases represent concentrated pools of influence, spending power, and visibility. A franchise with multiple players from a powerhouse college can attract sponsorships from corporations eager to tap into that cultural identity. Advertisements, endorsements, and event sponsorships often highlight player heritage, college affiliation, or regional connections, creating marketing narratives that bridge the gap between professional performance and collegiate tradition. The emotional resonance of loyalty translates directly into financial opportunity. Alumni donations also play a subtle but influential role. While primarily associated with college programs, alumni networks frequently extend their influence to professional teams, particularly in cities with strong local universities. These individuals often have the capacity to invest, sponsor, or otherwise support franchises through donations, season ticket packages, and participation in promotional events. The loyalty cultivated during college persists in adulthood, shaping patterns of engagement with professional teams. Executives understand this dynamic, leveraging college ties to attract investment and foster a sense of communal identity. Players who emerge from these programs carry with them a symbolic connection that can impact corporate and philanthropic decision-making. Merchandising provides another layer of financial influence. Fans who maintain loyalty to their alma mater often extend their identity to professional teams that feature former college stars. Jerseys, memorabilia, and branded apparel become a medium through which historical allegiance is expressed and monetized. Franchises capitalize on this by marketing players in the context of their collegiate legacy, offering merchandise that resonates with a dual identity: the pride of a professional fan combined with the enduring loyalty to a college program. The convergence of history and commerce ensures that rivalry and identity are not merely emotional constructs, but active drivers of revenue and engagement. Regional marketing strategies are deeply informed by college loyalties. Teams target communities where alumni and supporters of specific universities are concentrated, creating campaigns that emphasize continuity, shared identity, and cultural resonance. Tailored messaging, localized events, and targeted advertising reinforce the connection between college heritage and professional allegiance. By recognizing the value of these networks, franchises strengthen their brand, expand market share, and cultivate long-term fan loyalty. Regional rivalries in this context are not only competitive but also financially significant, shaping strategies for growth and sustainability. Player acquisition strategies are subtly influenced by financial considerations related to loyalty. Teams understand that drafting or signing players from historically significant colleges can have a ripple effect on fan engagement, sponsorship, and community support. A player's college affiliation may not be the sole factor in recruitment decisions, but it is often a contributing one, layered alongside skill, potential, and cultural fit. The financial calculus of loyalty intertwines with performance metrics, demonstrating that professional decisions are rarely purely athletic. College identity shapes perception, and perception drives revenue. The media also plays a critical role in monetizing loyalty. Broadcast contracts, network ratings, and advertising revenue are all impacted by the narratives surrounding college affiliations. Televised games featuring players from traditional rivals generate heightened interest, higher viewership, and increased commercial opportunities. Analysts emphasize backstory, history, and personal connections to elevate engagement, knowing that viewers respond emotionally to the continuity of identity. These narratives translate into measurable financial outcomes as advertising dollars follow audience attention and cultural resonance. The stories that emerge from college rivalries become profitable content for networks and franchises alike. Franchise culture itself is shaped by loyalty-driven economics. Teams actively cultivate a sense of tradition, connecting professional identity to historical allegiances. Alumni relations, fan events, and marketing campaigns often emphasize the legacy of players' college experience, framing professional football as a continuation of a larger cultural story. This strategy enhances engagement, strengthens brand loyalty, and creates long-term revenue streams. Loyalty is not only an emotional asset, but a financial one, embedded in organizational strategy and operational planning. Economic incentives also extend to coaching and staff hiring. Executives consider how the collective experience and heritage of coaching personnel may influence fan perception and community engagement. Coaches who attended respected universities carry symbolic value, signaling continuity and credibility. Their presence on staff can attract sponsorships, media attention, and fan participation, creating a multi-layered benefit that extends beyond immediate tactical expertise. The cultural capital associated with college affiliation is therefore intertwined with financial opportunity, influencing decisions at every level of franchise management. The ripple effects of loyalty-driven economics are evident in ticket sales. Fans are drawn to stadiums not only by professional allegiance, but by the continuation of collegiate identity. Special promotions, themed events, and alumni gatherings link the professional experience with the historical pride of college programs. The integration of past and present identities ensures that attendance is motivated by a blend of nostalgia, loyalty, and contemporary fandom. Revenue from ticket sales reflects this dynamic, highlighting the material impact of emotional continuity. Merchandise sales, sponsorships, media contracts, ticketing, and alumni engagement together illustrate that loyalty is not merely sentimental, but financial. College affiliation becomes a currency that franchises leverage in multiple arenas, translating historical allegiance into tangible revenue streams. The persistence of rivalry and identity from college to professional football demonstrates that the NFL operates not only as a sport, but as an ecosystem of culture, emotion, and finance. Decisions made on the field are informed by market realities shaped by loyalty, while off-field strategies are reinforced by the enduring power of cultural memory. In conclusion, the business of loyalty reveals the profound interconnectedness of emotion, identity, and finance in professional football. Sponsorships, alumni influence, merchandise, and regional marketing all demonstrate that college allegiances extend far beyond memory, shaping the financial framework of NFL franchises. Players, coaches, executives, and fans operate within a system where loyalty is both cultural and economic, influencing decisions, strategy, and perception. College football has left a tangible imprint on the professional game, embedding history into the very structure of the NFL. proving that the economics of rivalry are inseparable from the emotional legacy that continues to define the sport. In professional football, loyalty is both a virtue and a trap. Players often carry the weight of their college allegiances into the NFL, forming bonds, rivalries, and identities that extend far beyond personal performance. Yet some players choose to break from these inherited loyalties, seeking to define themselves anew in the professional arena. The consequences are rarely straightforward. Publicly distancing from a college identity can bring liberation, opportunity, and self-determination, but it can also provoke backlash, alienation, and scrutiny from fans, teammates, and media. These moments reveal the deep entanglement of personal identity, cultural expectation, and professional reality in the NFL. The phenomenon of rewriting allegiance begins with a psychological shift. Players often enter the league carrying the emotional residue of college rivalries. Their sense of belonging, competitive drive, and even strategic perspective are informed by past victories, losses, and relationships. To break from these allegiances requires conscious effort. It demands an assessment of self-definition, prioritization of professional loyalty over historical loyalty, and often public statements or symbolic gestures to signal the change. This act of separation challenges entrenched narratives, both personal and communal, creating tension between past and present identity. One notable example comes from a quarterback who had achieved national prominence at a storied Midwestern university. Entering the NFL, he chose to emphasize allegiance to his professional team over his collegiate past. He openly engaged in community programs in his franchise city, publicly supported rivalries that ran counter to his college history, and refused to participate in alumni media narratives. His actions were interpreted by some fans as betrayal, by others as maturity and professional focus. Teammates initially skeptical of his motives eventually recognized the strategic benefit of his neutrality, particularly in games where college loyalties could have created divisions in the locker room. This case illustrates both the personal and professional stakes of rewriting allegiance. The costs of severing college ties can be immediate and profound. Fans often perceive players as rejecting tradition, and media outlets capitalize on these narratives. Letters, calls, and public commentary frequently question the player's character, integrity, or commitment. Social media amplifies the response, creating a global conversation in which the player is judged against the standard of historical loyalty. Some players face sustained criticism that affects endorsement opportunities, public image, and personal confidence. The decision to redefine allegiance is therefore as much a calculated risk as it is a personal or ethical choice. Yet there are tangible benefits to embracing professional identity over college loyalty. Players who succeed in this transformation often find greater cohesion within their NFL teams by prioritizing professional goals over historical rivalry. They reduce potential friction with teammates from different collegiate backgrounds. Their focus shifts toward franchise success, team culture, and personal development in the professional environment. Coaches frequently note that players who demonstrate flexibility and allegiance are better positioned to navigate complex locker room dynamics, contribute to strategic cohesion, and serve as role models in environments where multiple identities converge. Rewriting allegiance also highlights the mutable nature of identity in professional football. College loyalty is deeply ingrained, shaped by years of socialization, coaching, fan expectation, and cultural narrative. Yet the NFL presents an opportunity to renegotiate that identity. Success requires negotiation between personal history and present responsibility. Players must reconcile pride in their formative experiences with the practical demands of a professional career. The act of redefining allegiance is therefore both a personal journey and a professional strategy, revealing the capacity of athletes to shape narrative, culture, and perception. The media plays a critical role in framing these transformations. Stories of players breaking from their college identity are often sensationalized, highlighting betrayal or controversy. Yet interviews with athletes reveal a more nuanced reality. Many see the act as a necessary step in establishing professional credibility, earning respect in a new environment, and prioritizing the collective goals of their team. Analysts note that these narratives often oversimplify the personal struggle, reducing complex decisions to headlines and soundbites. In truth, the process involves emotional labor, negotiation of expectation, and careful attention to personal and public identity. Historical examples underscore the enduring tension between college loyalty and professional autonomy. Players from major rivalry schools who entered the NFL in the 1970s and 1980s often faced pressure from alumni networks, fans, and local media to maintain visible connection to their collegiate past. Yet those who sought to emphasize professional identity over inherited loyalty frequently achieved greater career longevity, leadership credibility, and strategic influence within their teams. Their experiences illustrate the cost and reward inherent in rewriting allegiance, offering lessons for future generations of players navigating the intersection of history, identity, and professional ambition. Rewriting allegiance also reshapes fan perception. Audiences are conditioned to interpret player behavior through the lens of historical loyalty. When a player breaks from this expectation, it challenges assumptions, provokes debate, and forces reconsideration of the relationship between athlete and supporter. Fans who once projected a college-based identity onto a player must reconcile the tension between past association and present professionalism. The process is not universally smooth, yet it demonstrates the adaptability of culture and the capacity of professional football to evolve beyond inherited divisions. The act of redefining allegiance intersects with team culture. Players who openly prioritize professional identity contribute to an environment where performance and cohesion are paramount. Rivalries that might have caused friction in the locker room are mitigated by the example of those who place franchise loyalty above personal history. Coaches often recognize the value of such players as stabilizing forces, capable of bridging gaps between teammates with differing backgrounds and college affiliations. Rewriting allegiance thus has strategic implications, shaping team dynamics, influencing morale, and ultimately affecting competitive performance. The broader significance of this phenomenon lies in its revelation of professional football as a site of identity negotiation. Players are not merely athletes executing plays. They are individuals navigating complex cultural landscapes. College rivalries, personal history, fan expectation, and professional obligation converge, creating a context in which identity is continuously constructed, contested, and performed. Rewriting allegiance is a visible expression of agency within this system, demonstrating the capacity of players to assert control over narrative, perception, and professional trajectory. Ultimately, the stories of those who have broken from college loyalty illustrate the tension between inherited tradition and personal agency. Players face scrutiny, criticism, and uncertainty, yet they also access freedom, leadership, and professional clarity. The process underscores the enduring influence of college culture, while revealing the potential for transformation within the professional realm. In rewriting allegiance, athletes navigate both risk and opportunity, balancing personal integrity, team cohesion, and fan expectation. The decision shapes their legacy, their relationships, and the emotional landscape of the NFL itself. Rewriting allegiance is more than an individual choice. It reflects the persistence of college identity within professional football and the ways in which athletes navigate that legacy. It underscores the complexity of loyalty, illustrating that emotional, cultural, and financial considerations are intertwined in the fabric of the league. Players who successfully navigate this transformation demonstrate resilience, insight, and leadership, redefining what it means to belong in a league where history, rivalry, and identity intersect. In conclusion, the act of publicly breaking from college loyalties illuminates the nuanced interplay of history, emotion, and professionalism in the NFL. These players challenge inherited expectations, negotiate identity, and influence both team dynamics and public perception. The stories reveal that loyalty is not fixed, but rather a malleable force shaped by personal choice, strategic consideration, and cultural context. Rewriting Allegiance exposes the weight of inherited identity and the power of professional autonomy, offering a profound perspective on the human dimension of football at its highest level. The NFL today exists in a complex web of history, culture, and inherited emotion. Decades of college rivalries have left an indelible mark on the professional game, shaping scouting decisions, K-media narratives, fan perception, and the very mentality of players. The divide created in the collegiate environment continues to echo through locker rooms, boardrooms, and stadiums, influencing how the league functions, how individuals approach their careers, and how stories are told. Understanding this legacy requires examining not only the structural and operational aspects of the NFL, but also the subtle psychological and cultural forces that stem from generations of rivalry. Scouting and recruitment remain profoundly affected by college allegiance. Evaluators often carry biases rooted in personal history, geographic familiarity, or institutional loyalty. Executives who attended particular colleges or grew up in regions dominated by specific programs bring a lens shaped by identity, perception, and past competition. While statistics, athletic performance, and measurable skills are central to evaluations, there is an unspoken layer of judgment influenced by the reputation and rivalry history of a player's college. This influence extends to draft positioning, contract negotiation, and long-term career planning. A player from a historically rival institution may face skepticism or heightened scrutiny, while a player from a favored program may receive implicit benefits based on cultural familiarity. The subtlety of these biases illustrates the ongoing power of college legacy in shaping professional opportunities. Media coverage amplifies the legacy of division. Sports journalists, commentators, and analysts often draw upon narratives rooted in historic rivalries, framing professional games as extensions of college competition. Players are frequently positioned in stories not only based on current performance, but also on the symbolic weight of their educational background. Headlines, commentary, and highlight reels emphasize past associations, fostering a continuous connection between college identity and professional perception. Fans are drawn into these narratives, reinforcing tribal loyalties and perpetuating the emotional resonance of historical rivalries. The media becomes both a chronicler and a perpetuator of the divide, ensuring that the cultural legacy of college football remains deeply intertwined with professional storytelling. Player mentality is also profoundly shaped by the history of rivalry. Athletes carry the pride, resentment, and competitive lessons of their college experiences into the professional realm. Locker rooms are microcosms of these larger cultural dynamics, populated by individuals whose identities are partially defined by historic allegiances. Coaches and teammates must navigate this complex emotional landscape, balancing individual ego, team cohesion, and strategic objectives. Players who internalize the legacy of rivalry often approach competition with heightened intensity, awareness, and sometimes anxiety. Their decision-making, leadership style, and performance can all be influenced by the unresolved tension of past loyalties. The persistence of these influences is evident in the ongoing culture of professional football. Rivalries between NFL teams often reflect, at least in part, the regional and historical rivalries that originated in college. Fans frequently align themselves not merely by franchise affiliation, but by the continuation of allegiance to collegiate roots. This alignment shapes attendance, merchandise sales, and engagement across media platforms. Teams recognize this dynamic, leveraging the emotional continuity of rivalry to strengthen branding, marketing, and fan loyalty. The professional league benefits commercially and culturally from the enduring influence of college identity, demonstrating that rivalry is both a source of tension and opportunity. The legacy of the divide also manifests in interpersonal dynamics. Players from opposing college programs may experience tension in training camps, during practices, and on the field. While professional focus often moderates extreme expressions of rivalry, the psychological imprint of past competition informs interactions, trust, and communication. Coaches and team leaders often manage these dynamics explicitly, acknowledging the potential for conflict while fostering a professional culture that prioritizes team success. The enduring presence of collegiate identity means that professional football is not only a contest of skill, but also a negotiation of memory, culture, and personal history. Strategically, the divide informs decision-making at every level of the league. Management may consider college history when constructing rosters, evaluating potential free agents, or determining draft strategies. A player who performed against a particular rival at the collegiate level may carry a reputation that affects professional assessment, whether accurately or through the lens of historical bias. Rivalries create layers of expectation and perception, influencing not only competitive dynamics, but also the business and organizational structures of the league. Understanding this context is essential to comprehending the culture, decision-making, and evolution of professional football. The long shadow of college rivalries extends to coaching as well. Coaches who faced each other in collegiate contexts often bring the residual tension, strategic insight, and emotional imprint of those contests into the NFL. Their approach to game planning, leadership, and player development may reflect lessons learned from historic rivalries. Teams benefit from this strategic depth while simultaneously navigating the challenges of personal history and cultural memory. Rivalries become part of the intellectual framework of professional football, shaping thought processes and influencing outcomes at the highest level of the sport. The psychological dimension of rivalry is particularly significant for younger players entering the league. Drafted athletes must reconcile personal ambition with inherited cultural expectations. They are tasked with understanding the professional context while managing the weight of college identity, media narratives, and fan perception. Some embrace these legacies as motivation. Others experience conflict and pressure. The ability to navigate these influences often separates those who adapt successfully from those who struggle with expectation, scrutiny, or personal identity. In this sense, the legacy of the divide is not merely historical, but actively present in shaping professional trajectories. Cultural continuity also persists among fans and communities. Alumni networks, local traditions, and social media engagement all serve to reinforce the emotional link between college and professional football. Supporters often interpret professional performance through the lens of collegiate loyalty, assessing players not only on current merit, but also on symbolic representation of historic affiliation. Rivalries are relived, extended, and magnified, creating a sense of ongoing cultural and emotional engagement that transcends individual games or seasons. This continuity reinforces the notion that professional football is inseparable from the historical and social frameworks established by college football. In conclusion, the legacy of the divide is a defining feature of the NFL. College rivalries continue to influence scouting, media, player mentality, coaching strategy, and fan engagement. The league is both a continuation and an evolution of historical competition, embedding the emotional, cultural, and strategic lessons of collegiate football into the professional arena. Understanding this legacy is essential for comprehending the depth of player experience, organizational decision-making, and fan culture. The divide is not merely a relic of the past. It is a living force, shaping behavior, identity, and the narrative of professional football today. The emotional, cultural, and strategic echoes of college rivalries remind us that the NFL is not only a game of physical prowess, but also a stage upon which history, identity, and loyalty are continually enacted and contested. Professional football is inseparable from the collegiate roots that inform its ethos, and the divide between historic rivalries remains a central factor in understanding the modern sport. The stories of players, coaches, fans, and franchises demonstrate that the legacy of the divide is enduring, pervasive, and deeply influential. coloring every aspect of the professional game from draft rooms to locker rooms, and from media narratives to the psychological framework of competition. The past remains present, and the echoes of rivalry continue to shape the league at every level. Professional football is a stage upon which the human need for identity, belonging, and opposition is played out with intensity and permanence. The story of the NFL is inseparable from the legacy of college rivalries, yet the significance of these feuds extends far beyond wins and losses. They reveal something fundamental about the way Americans construct community, define loyalty, and confront difference. The tribal instincts cultivated in classrooms, stadiums, and dormitories centuries ago have found expression in professional locker rooms, boardrooms, and fan culture. These rivalries illuminate the paradox of passion, the same forces that inspire greatness. Devotion and excellence can also create division, suspicion, and conflict. Understanding the NFL through this lens is to recognize that the game is as much a reflection of human nature as it is a sport. From the earliest days of college football, the intensity of rivalry was rooted in more than athletics. It was tied to geography, class, culture, and social networks. Schools like Harvard and Yale, Michigan and Ohio State, Texas and Oklahoma became symbols of broader regional identity. Victories on the field were victories for entire communities, and defeat carried an emotional weight that extended far beyond the scoreboard. The NFL inherited these pressures as players, coaches, and administrators brought with them histories of triumph, resentment, and allegiance. Early professional teams were often composed of men whose identities were already forged in the heat of these collegiate battles. The league's growth and its cultural integration cannot be understood without acknowledging how these inherited rivalries shaped behavior, loyalty, and perception. Tribal loyalty within the NFL manifests in multiple ways. Fans carry the pride and bitterness of college affiliations into professional arenas. Players internalize the lessons of past competition, sometimes translating them into teamwork and motivation, but other times allowing them to create friction and discord. Executives and scouts make decisions filtered through cultural assumptions and historical perspectives, sometimes valuing a player more for alma mater than ability. Media narratives thrive on these divisions, highlighting storylines of betrayal, redemption, or ongoing feuds. In every layer of the league, college rivalries act as a lens through which performance, character, and significance are measured. The persistence of this lens speaks to the enduring human fascination with group identity and opposition. Yet the cost of tribal loyalty is evident. Football, by its very nature, demands cooperation, coordination, and trust. The success of a team depends on the willingness of individuals to subordinate personal animosities to collective objectives. College rivalries carried into the NFL complicate this process. Locker rooms became sites of negotiation, diplomacy, and sometimes silent tension. Players from opposing collegiate programs had to learn to navigate emotional histories while performing at the highest level. Coaches often found themselves mediating conflicts, rooted not in the present competition, but in past grievances. Rivalries intensified scrutiny, magnified mistakes, and sometimes compromised cohesion. The very passion that elevated the game also made it more fragile, more susceptible to internal conflict, and more reflective of human complexity. The paradox of passion is central to understanding professional football. Rivalries create meaning, intensity, and narrative. They generate stories that transcend the field and bind generations of fans to a shared cultural memory. They motivate players to push beyond limits, inspire communities, and generate national attention. Yet the same rivalries produce fragmentation, partiality, and sometimes hostility. The energy derived from tribal loyalty can elevate the spectacle of the game, while simultaneously straining the principles of unity and collaboration essential to team success. This tension between the power of passion and its potential for disruption mirrors broader social dynamics. It demonstrates how deeply human desires for belonging and recognition can produce both greatness and conflict. In reflecting on these dynamics, it becomes clear that the NFL functions as a mirror of society. The league illustrates the interplay of identity, loyalty, ambition, and emotion in ways that are both vivid and enduring. Players embody the weight of personal history and regional affiliation. Fans act as custodians of collective memory and cultural expectation. Media and executives navigate the intersection of storytelling, strategy, and commerce. The game becomes a lens through which broader social truths about community, rivalry, and human motivation can be observed. Football, in this sense, is not merely entertainment, but a cultural laboratory, revealing the structures and impulses that define human experience. The legacy of college rivalries also underscores the temporal dimension of identity. These feuds are transmitted across generations, shaping expectations, narratives, and behavior long after the original participants have left the field. Fans inherit allegiance through family, community, and regional tradition. Players internalize lessons of competition and loyalty that influence professional conduct. Executives and coaches carry institutional memory that informs decision-making and strategy. The NFL is a living repository of these histories, continuously negotiating the interplay between inherited identity and contemporary performance. The endurance of these rivalries reflects the power of cultural memory to shape behavior across time. At the same time, the evolution of the league demonstrates the potential for adaptation and growth. While rivalries persist, the professional environment requires players to integrate diverse backgrounds, manage competing identities, and prioritize collective goals. Some athletes have successfully rewritten allegiance, redefining loyalty and expanding the meaning of professionalism. Coaches have learned to balance historical tension with team cohesion. Media has gradually embraced more nuanced narratives that consider context and complexity. The NFL has matured alongside its inherited culture, finding ways to channel the energy of rivalry into performance and spectacle without allowing it to undermine organizational objectives. Ultimately, the story of college rivalries in the NFL is a story of human nature. It is about the ways in which identity, memory, and emotion shape behavior. It is about the balance between individual pride and collective responsibility. It is about the paradoxical power of passion to inspire and divide. The league's history demonstrates that greatness and conflict are inseparable. That competition is both a unifying and fragmenting force, and that loyalty carries both rewards and costs. Players, coaches, executives, and fans navigate these dynamics continuously, negotiating the terrain of inherited allegiances while pursuing professional excellence. In conclusion, the NFL's enduring connection to college rivalries is more than a historical curiosity. It is a central feature of the league's culture, shaping scouting, media narratives, team cohesion, and fan engagement. It illuminates fundamental truths about human behavior, identity, and the search for belonging. Rivalries create meaning and narrative, intensify competition, and engage audiences across generations. Yet they also challenge unity, complicate relationships, and highlight the fragility of collaboration. The league is at once elevated and divided by the forces of passion, rivalry, and loyalty. The history and legacy of these rivalries offer a lens through which to understand the human dimensions of professional football. They remind us that the sport is not only a contest of physical skill, but a reflection of social, emotional, and cultural reality. The players, coaches, and fans who navigate these dynamics are participating in a complex system of identity, expectation, and performance. The lessons of rivalry are enduring, providing insight into the nature of competition, the power of tradition, and the cost of tribal loyalty. Professional football is ultimately a mirror of human society. The game magnifies the tension between individual pride and collective obligation. It exposes the ways in which memory and identity shape behavior. It demonstrates that passion, loyalty, and rivalry are both sources of strength and vectors of conflict. The NFL, in its structure, culture, and legacy, reflects the same contradictions, ambitions, and struggles that define human nature. Its story is the story of desire for belonging, the drive to compete, and the perpetual negotiation between self and community. In the end, the legacy of college rivalries is a reminder that football is more than a sport. It is an arena where human identity, culture, and emotion are enacted, observed, and transmitted. It is a reflection of our deepest instincts for belonging, opposition, and meaning. The game continues to thrive, in part because of these forces. But it also continues to challenge, divide, and compel those who participate in it. The NFL teaches that the glory of competition is inseparable from its complexity, and that the passions which make the game extraordinary also carry the weight of history, expectation, and human nature. Professional football endures because it captures the essence of human experience. It channels rivalry, ambition, and identity into a structured contest of skill, strategy, and will. College rivalries shaped this evolution, leaving a legacy that is still felt in every draft room, locker room, and stadium. The game is a testament to the power of tradition, the endurance of memory, and the complexity of loyalty. It is a mirror of the human condition, reflecting the contradictions, passions, and aspirations that define us. Football is both a unifier and a divider, a source of inspiration and tension, and a vivid expression of what it means to belong, to compete, and to witness history unfold on the field. The story of rivalry, loyalty, and identity in professional football concludes not with resolution, but with reflection. It reminds us that the sport is a living narrative, continuously negotiating the forces of past and present, individual and collective, passion and principle. The NFL, shaped by generations of inherited competition, offers insight into the human psyche, the power of tradition, and the enduring need for belonging. Rivalries remain, passions persist, and the game continues to mirror our most elemental instincts. Football is at once history, culture, and human drama. It is a testament to the way identity, loyalty, and rivalry shape not only a sport, but the people who devote themselves to it. This is the enduring legacy of college rivalries in the NFL. The game is more than strategy and skill. It is the reflection of human ambition, fear, pride, and perseverance. It teaches us that passion can inspire and divide, that loyalty can elevate and complicate, and that the pursuit of greatness is inseparable from the weight of identity. Football is a living story, a cultural mirror, and a human drama. In every snap, in every play, in every interaction, the echoes of the past remind us who we are, what we value, and why we compete. The NFL remains a testament to the power of rivalry, the depth of loyalty, and the enduring complexity of human nature. This is the story of the game, the story of rivalry, and ultimately, the story of ourselves. It is a reflection of the forces that drive us, the loyalties that define us, and the passions that shape our lives. Professional football, with all its glory and contradiction, is nothing less than a mirror of humanity,